Hello and welcome to today's episode of Talk on Things and Stuff. We've got a treat for you today. Now, if you've been following the show, you know that I've tried to reach out and have a little bit more collaboration with some of the people who are podcasting on the faithful side of this question of Mormonism, specifically the Midnight Mormons, where you can find Cardin Ellis and Kwaku L and Brad Whitbeck giving their own take on Mormonism and in defense of the faith. Well, if you have checked out their channel and follow their discussions, which I find, it's actually quite enjoyable to pull out the popcorn and see what types of rationales and defenses that they're going to offer. In one of their recent streams, they describe an event where they decided to go to the headquarters or to a visitor center for Scientology and find out if all the rumors and all the things that the Scientologists were, that the ex-Scientologists were saying about that faith were true or lies. And the justification for this, as they'll discuss, was that we're living in an age where it seems like you can't really trust any media anywhere. And they feel like the Mormon church is being misrepresented in the media by its critics. So is it possible that the Church of Scientology is also being misrepresented? And it's not this weird, crazy cult that some of the ex-Mormon or ex-Scientology critics seem to be painting it as. So if you followed the channel for a while, I was also part of a group called the Three Apostates, wherein an ex-Jehovah's Witness, an ex-Scientologist, and myself as an ex-Mormon kind of compared notes on our experiences in our respective groups. And the Scientologist that was part of the Three Apostates was Chris Shelton, who has a fantastic channel on his own where he talks about all sorts of things dealing with, what cults or his experience in Scientology, or just the mechanisms of thought reform and undue influence, which are kind of the nut and bolts of what you have to understand in order to be able to process what the experience is coming out of one of these groups. Well, I reached out to Chris and told him that this, this group of Mormon defenders went and visited his, the home turf where he used to have his stomping grounds, and just wanted to see if he would be open to kind of doing a hot take on their experience. And he graciously accepted. So I want to invite to our stream here, Chris Shelton. Chris, how's it going?
Hey, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for this opportunity, Jonathan. It should be fun.
I saw that and I'm like, there's no way they're going to do this. And then they actually kind of give a narrative for it. I'm like, oh, Chris has to see this. I want to see his take on it. Now, to be clear, I told you don't watch it. I'm not even going to send you the link because I want to get your live reaction to this. But upon just hearing the notion, like, what immediately comes through your head?
Well, cult apologia, of course, and naive people doing naive things to try to justify belief, which is par for the course. I mean, it's not, I could have easily done the exact same thing when I was a Scientologist. So
hold on, because you're saying cult apologia, but they're not, it's like they're defending Scientology and they're defending Mormonism by defending Scientology. Like, where's the logic there?
Well, because of as you mentioned, because of the bad press, right? They feel there's common ground on lies in the media, fake news, right?
Yeah, I guess in the age where we've all to some extent lost faith in some of the institutions of truth.
That's right.
that we've had. So there is a sort of logic to just the project in and of itself.
Exactly. And also, we should be clear about the fact that the losing faith in institutions is a very selective thing. I mean, people have doubled down on their religious institutions or their flat earth or conspiracy or culty kind of stuff, and very much believe in the authority of that. It's just that when the mainstream authorities don't agree with their extremist beliefs, that they have a problem. And that's where the rift is actually coming from.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Now, I mentioned to you before we were on the air that I've tried to really foster and keep an authentic, good rapport with the guys that you're going to see in just a little bit here. They are new to you, though. You really haven't encountered this particular group of apologetics, so you're gonna see some fun personalities here.
Yeah.
There's Cardin, the boisterous one, who's kind of like a Mormon Alex Jones type guy, and there's Kwaku L, who's like the slick, smooth, cool guy, and so And then there's Brad Beardy Head Whitbeck, who is only wearing a beard because he's in a movie production having to do with the church. But I reached out to them, and they may actually join us later. So hopefully they're kind of following along with the stream, and when they get a chance to hop in, can go from there. But why don't we just dive in? And I'm going to bring up on the screen the stream.
Okay.
It's called... let's see here. Why am I getting an echo? Hopefully that won't happen. It was a stream called Twitter Midnight Mormons, Let's Go. And they talk about a bunch of different stuff. But if you go to about the hour and 7-minute mark, that's where we're going to start our review and discussion. And I will just let it play. And if you need to say anything at any point, just hit stop and we'll comment on it.
Okay, got it.
All right, here we go.
I bet in the next like 10 or 15
Scientology
minutes.
is
But
kind of true. I just want to make it clear. It's a little bit true. Okay.
Well, I mean, there's a ton of different ways to say things that we believe, right? There's a ton of crossover.
well, basically, do you
I
have
held those
the pics?
cans. That
What?
thing worked.
Yeah. Okay. So just so the audience knows,
Wait, what is he talking about? Because
talking
that
about
quote, he's like, I held these cans.
Yeah, yeah. He's a true believer, man. He was convinced by the pinch test, I guess. So
What is he talking about?
They're talking about the electropsychometer or the e-meter, and it's one of the gadgets of Scientology that really does help convince people. It's an electronic device that measures skin resistance to an electric flow, and that's all it's doing. But Scientologists have this real lore and mythology mixed up with the e-meter. And because people generally don't understand how electronics works and how their body works and stuff like that, they fall for Scientology's nonsensical explanations of that very easily. And so when he sits here talking about how, oh, that e-meter works, man, I'm like, you okay, all right, cool. Tell me more.
Well, so the thing about Kwaku is that you can never tell when he's trolling and making a joke to make a point, or when he's being authentic. But it's entertaining no matter what. So
Yes.
I mean, I always hold that in the back of my head. So, you know, and at no point, like I think this exercise is not to point our fingers at these guys and say, look what a bunch of dopes they are. It's more like just like these are guys who they're even open to considering what are the good parts of Scientology. And so they're making themselves vulnerable, going into their space and seeing what comes their way. And I think there's something fun about that. If you can keep a safe distance. Okay, so let's keep going here.
we met up and we decided to have a little bit of fun together as a group. And Kwaku here loves the fact that the Church of Scientology basically has its own private army,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And so we decided we want to go down there. Everybody has heard all of the worst rumors about Scientology, just like everybody has always heard all of the worst rumors about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and Catholicism, and everybody knows the meme of a faith, and everybody knows the bad historical baggage of a faith, but nobody ever actually knows what it's like to step foot into a chapel. Ask an anti-Catholic what a Catholic mass is like, and he's never been to a cathedral. Ask an anti-Mormon what Mormonism's like, and they've never stepped foot into a chapel. And everybody you've seen Going Clear and seen Leah Ramini and Scientology in the Aftermath, or whatever the show is, but none of them have actually ever stepped into a Church of Scientology. And there's tons of them here in LA, like Scientology.
Let's yeah, that's an interesting point he's making there. What do you have to say about that?
Well, what I have to say about that is that is a very weird thing to say, given that everybody who I know who has something negative to say about Scientology has something negative to say about it because of their own personal experience with Scientology. So he's making a claim here that has absolutely no basis in fact. And he just tosses this off as though he can dismiss all criticism of Mormonism, Catholicism, Scientology, simply because none of these critics have any lived experience of it. I sit here in front of you with 27 years of professional Scientology experience and a lifetime of lived experience with it. So am I his exception to his rule? I don't think so. When I think about Leah, Mike, Rinder, you know, the legion of people that this man watched, if he watched Scientology in the aftermath, parade before him, all from lived experience of Scientology. So I find his criticism right out of the gate to be disingenuous and dishonest. So I'm like, really, dude? That's really where you're coming from on this? I have to protest.
Well, I want to make this point that, like, can you give us just a really quick summation of the gravitas with which you bring, the bona fides that you bring to this? Like, what is, like, you're not somebody who's like, yeah, I was in Scientology for 3 months and then it wasn't that good.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that, because I was involved with Scientology. I was raised in it. My parents got involved with Scientology, very, very much got involved with it when I was 4 years old. And I grew up with it. It was a household thing. L. Ron Hubbard was the guy, and the Scientology rules and guidelines and ethics and morals, that was my ethical code. That was how I was living my life. And when I graduated high school, I immediately was recruited into and started working for the Church of Scientology. And I did that for 8 years in Santa Barbara, California, working for the church. And then I joined their private army, the Sea Organization, I was going
to ask about that.
Yeah, as they correctly note, it is a private army, and it was L. Ron Hubbard's private army, and I was part of it. From 1995 until 2012, 17 years, I worked in that group, and that's 24/7. That is hardcore. You dedicate your life. It's a monastic existence. So that was my life until I got out in 2013. And since then, not only did I get out and create a YouTube channel and kind of complain about it, I've actually interviewed sociologists, psychologists, neuroscientists about the subject of Scientology, destructive cults, and coercive control. And I've gone on to get a university level master's education in the psychology of coercive control since then, which is a program I just recently completed the requirements for, and I'm going to be getting those letters after my name. So I've taken this whole topic very seriously. This is not some sideline little bitch fest I have. This is something I work very hard at, and I take the whole topic pretty seriously, because it's when you get past the memes and you get past the jokes, there is a very serious topic here.
Yeah.
And that's where I come from on this. So.
Yeah. And to my viewers who this is perhaps your first introduction to Chris, definitely check out his channel, where he has not only his own backstory, but all of this additional wealth of information about coercive control and psychological manipulation. But then also he did a extensive long form interview with John DeLynn to kind of look at that Mormon versus Scientology perspective. And you can find his story there on the Mormon Stories podcast as well. Now, Chris, I want to, because I try every time I have a criticism for these guys, I try to say, well, how did they make this argument? It's not just a argument from complete, they're complete doofuses. And I think what he's pointing to is that you have the critics, and the critics puts ideas out into the public consciousness, and then the public consumes those ideas and has an opinion about the group. And I think what he's saying there is that the critics fill the public discourse with this, what he would consider to be biased depiction of what the organization is. And then the people imbibe that information and form an opinion, and now they're going to participate in the discourse with an inherent bias about the organization, even though they themselves have never been in the organization. They've only been subject to the critics. And I think in his commentary there, even though his words didn't exactly say it the right way, I think that was the intention of what he said. And that's a legitimate way to describe how public discourse happens, but that's different from the legitimacy of the criticisms and the people who are initially making those criticisms. Does that make sense?
Yes, I would agree completely with that. And in fact, I will add right here, I'll give him and anybody the fact that exaggerations happen, lies happen, right? Media will sensationalize the most salacious bits of a story. It becomes trauma porn. And that's not cool. We don't want that either.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's interesting how the rules of public discourse have certain demands. And I'm not at all justifying this. I'm not a reporter. I'm not a media personality that way. I don't do this. But I understand that it's done in order to sell ads, right? Sell copy. So I understand that reporters and media outlets will exacerbate or exaggerate stories for effect. However, I know the true stories behind all that, and and they're not exaggerating that much. So there's, so to simply throw out the baby with the bathwater because you found a discrepancy, a lie, an untruth, that's just as wrong as what he's doing, dismissing all the criticism wholesale because, they were never really part of it or something.
Right.
This logical fallacy on top of it.
I found that in the community of people who've left Mormonism, because it is that question of whether something is true or not that is at the heart of the reason why many people choose to leave, truth and fidelity become very, very important. And so when we encounter former Mormons who do the thing where they exaggerate or make things up or depict things in a falsely exaggerated negative light, it really is frustrating because they're undermining the credibility of those of us who have legitimate criticisms about it. So there was a guy named Ed Decker who in the 1980s did this thing called God Makers. And in the sequel, there were some claims that were just so far beyond the pale and didn't represent the actual Mormonism that it discredited people who had been associated with him in the past. And so that is the type of kind of importance that actual truth telling is. And I don't know if you've experienced anything like that on the Scientology end.
Absolutely, of course. The biggest problem, and I'll just throw this out there to respond both to their arguments and to what you're saying, is that the nuances of Mormonism and Scientology are not necessarily easily understood by the general public unless you go diving in. And so us ex-members who do understand those nuances because we lived it, we will say things to somebody who doesn't really get those differences, and then they will exaggerate or overgeneralize. For example, I was a Sea Org member. As a Sea Org member, I was physically abused. That doesn't mean every single Scientologist is physically abused, but I will make the argument that almost every single Sea Org member is. And that's a difference, but it's a nuanced difference.
Yeah.
And
I mean, as a layperson, I didn't even know that there was a distinction between Sea Org and general Scientology. So
exactly. So, so somebody might make, and I'm just throwing this out there as a non-Mormon, right? Example is, somebody might make a critical remark or statement or expose something about a temple ceremony. And then somebody who's not a Mormon might think every Mormon does that or thinks that or knows that, when in fact, only people who have been in the temple would know that, right?
Yeah. All right. Well, I would say let's keep going, but I think we have been graced by the presence of none other than Cardin Ellis from the Midnight Mormons.
Yeah, I did a great job spelling my name right there.
Midnight Mormons.
Yeah. I'm missing the
Cardin,
other studio, though.
Have you been able to catch any of the streams so far?
What'd you say?
Have you been able to catch any of the streams so far, or do we need to bring you up to speed?
Oh, no. I watched the whole thing.
Okay.
Let me see. I was pleasured to hear that I'm already a cultapologia person.
Okay. All right.
But apparently I'm seeking common ground with the Scientologists, and that apparently this is all an effort to double down upon my institutional love for lost causes and besmirched faiths as a nonsensical defensor who has absolutely no basis in fact. So, yeah, happy to be here. Nice.
Cardin is showing us his best victimhood shield, and he does a really good job of this.
I'm not a victim.
I'm going to depict anything that you say as an offense to me, and so I can hold up the shield of victimhood. And then, anyway, so Cardin,
I've adopted the language of my accusers, bro.
Yeah. Okay, so I've invited Chris to comment on this, and I'm going to let him kind of drive the commentary. So anytime we pause, I want to give him first shot.
Go for it.
And then certainly give you a chance to respond to that, because we're responding to you in this thing anyway. But I'm really stoked that this is your first appearance on my channel. I've been on your channel several times, dude. WTF? What the flip?
Yeah. Well, you did tell me 2 p.m. And then
there was you checked the text. I corrected myself. No.
Okay, keep going, brother.
All right, so let's keep going. All right. Oh, so Chris.
Yes.
This is Cardin. Cardin. This is Chris.
Hi, Cardin.
Lifelong former Scientologist, consultant to Leah Remini on one of her shows and several other cult documentaries, as well as a degree-holding cult expert. Not a cult expert. That's a bad word, but at any rate, okay, here we go. So we're gonna dive
expert because he's in the Apple cult. You know what I mean, he's a fellow
and the Batman cult. He's apparently into DC rather than Marvel. So
I'm in both of those cults. You know what I'm saying? Got the Apple Watch, got the Apple iPhone, got the Apple laptop.
No,
my assistant makes fun of me when I charge all 3 of them and calls it my Apple altar. So we got a lot in common.
Okay.
Let's
Let's keep going. We're proceeding.
Scientology is huge in Los Angeles, right? And so we decided to go to the main building.
Oh yeah.
You know what I'm saying? We decided to go to the main Church of Scientology, the big blue building, and literally just cold call them and walk right in and just see what the actual experience was like. Just like a non-member of our faith were to walk into the visitor center, I guess the LA Temple, we decided we want to go and have the authentic experience, not having set it up ahead of time. So we're getting them at their just regular. Okay. And should we just talk a little bit before we go about how it went?
Yeah, dude. I mean,
Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about the strategy here of the cold call. What do you think, Chris? Is this something that Scientology is prepared for? Is this something they expect? How common is it for people to just walk in out of the blue and catch them off guard?
Well, yes, they want people coming in. I mean, that's how they try to procure new members, is they have open door policy. People come in and they have introductory services that they want to offer those people, which I imagine is what occurred here. Is you went in and did a personality test, or did you try to talk to the PR people, or what did you do?
We actually just literally walked straight through the front door. I lived in Children's Hospital of Los Angeles for all of 2017, which is the neighboring facility. The Sea Org building, actually I shouldn't call it the Sea Org building. I should call it the Blue Scientology building. Actually used to be a major hospital in a very large complex of hospitals.
Yeah. That facility is where I worked for 17 years.
Yes.
Okay.
So I've driven by it a million times. Okay. I mean, L. Ron Hubbard Lane was literally a cross street of my de facto domicile for about 11 months straight. Okay. So I passed over the tracks of Scientology twice a day as I came to and from the hospital room with my daughter. So I was familiar with where it was. And in one of our podcasts, we had, I don't even remember how we tangentially had mentioned Scientology, but I had casually referenced that the headquarters were only about 20 minutes from my house. Kwaku got excited and said we should go. So we pretty much just had an impromptu, let's do this on a Sunday because we're already dressed up decently. And let's see what the truth is. And this is the only reason why I push back on your saying that we're just apologia people trying to find common ground with Scientologists. No, we literally just said, I wonder what the truth is. Because, like, for example, just this year alone, John Deland has accused our church of getting his TikTok profile removed, and he's probably the #1 guy that you guys interact with, which is absolutely absurd. And then he posts an old picture from TikTok in 2017 as proof. He said he called the cops on us for fair gaming him, and then we called the cops to get a copy of the 911 call he said he did, and there was nothing there. He also has accused the church of sending underground concubines, like literal seducing women, to try and go look this up. It's on his social media profile from 2 or 3 weeks ago. And we have the screenshots before he edited it when he got called out on it. But he literally accused our church of sending attractive agents to try and seduce him in order to catch him in a public scandal. So all of these I factually know are false because I have personally interacted with the man and the faith. And so any other layman that looks at this guy, who's a very prominent commentator on our faith, will get a horrendously unfair and untrue, factually untrue. I mean, as in, we have recordings talking with law enforcement in Utah that he lied about having called the cops. Okay. He's just.
So Cardin, would you summarize your position then that you feel like Mormonism has been given a kind of a bad name, in part built on things that you believe to be manipulations and deceptions on the part of its critics? And so the question then was, I wonder, from your perspective, that's the case. And so the Mormonism that you know and hold in your life is nothing like what is being depicted from the critics. And so the question was, I wonder if this is also happening to Scientology, where all the criticisms are fabrications. And I think that question is actually a really interesting question. And so discerning then the truth from the fiction is important. And
yes,
the question, I think by going to Scientology headquarters, you are specifically going to the center where, would you say that it's in their interest to only bring the positive and to discount or not even bring up the negative when you go to headquarters as a cold call?
Yes. Now we did the cold call on purpose though, because I'm no stranger to this game. I know I've worked in radio and I've worked in Los Angeles and I've worked in independent film and cinema and television and everything. And I'm very aware that if you call ahead of time and say, oh, we'd like to have an interview, you're going to get nothing but the best and the brightest. And you're going to get everybody with their best foot forward. And they're going to research you. And so you won't get the
okay,
wrong.
I want to take that point because that's an excellent point. Now, Chris, you were in that organization, so you may have had personal lived experience in the people who would be facing the public who come cold call or in a pre-arranged call. Is that concern that Cardin just expressed, where they may stage something if they know you're coming, and it will be a different take than if you come in cold off the street? Is that legitimate, or what's the difference there? How would they prepare for one versus the other?
No, that's a legitimate concern, but there's an underlying fundamental problem in the logic of this approach of we're going to cold call and get the truth.
What is that? That
the truth of these organizations exists at their lowest levels.
Yeah,
and
well,
you can walk
Chris,
in,
Cardin, let Chris make his point real quick, and then you can respond.
Yeah, you're going to walk in from the street, and you're going to pierce the corporate veil of this multinational organization that's been abusing people for decades with your street smarts and your iPhone. Really? Is that really the idea here?
No, but thank you for proving me right.
Okay, Cardin, just hold on, Cardin. Cardin, you are in defensive mode. I can feel it.
No.
It's in the air. Okay. So
I did listen to the first 10 minutes of this podcast.
Okay,
God.
well, you need to go back and talk about where we defended your project in and of itself.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's not all bad. It's not all Cardin's a doofus.
No. And by the way, I'm not in defensive note. I am literally established the truth. And sometimes these things have to be addressed with a razor and not a bludgeon, like Barack Obama said. Okay. And the fact is this: I didn't think that by going down there and cold calling them, Chris, that I was going to pierce a corporate veil and get the truth. I mean, I find it a little disappointing if a guy with your history in radio and religion and film, and not film, but entertainment and so on and so forth, would really think that somebody of my experience is that doe-eyed and naive. I didn't think I was going to get the truth, but I thought there was a pretty good chance that I would get more truth than I have gotten through the traditional avenues of media that have a vested interest in making the church look bad. When you talk to a pro-Scientologist, you get pro-Scientology. They tell you how it will be and it's going to be awesome. When you talk to an anti-Scientologist, you get drastic anti-Scientology. I wanted to have a personal experience so my truth could be based on a personal experience. So I went down there seeking that, and that's it. The weird thing is everybody adds all kinds of intentions onto it afterwards. And that's where I take issue with the whole religious conversation, is they say you went down there not because you simply said, hey, let's see what the truth is as we experience it. No, it must have been because you're doubling down on your defense of unfair attacks of your Mormonism. No, we literally just want to have some fun on a Saturday.
Cardin, give us some credit, okay? In your conversation, you specifically draw this contrast between the critic, the info in the air based on the critics and your lived experience as Mormonism, and then ask this question about Scientology. So I think it's fair to say that there is this juxtaposition of the two experiences that you're looking to explore a little more. And I hear you saying that you acknowledge that by going in cold, you are getting a bias in favor of the church in your experience there, and that you understand that there are critics who will have criticisms that are legitimate and based on real experiences, but you just want to have exposed yourself to both sides so that at least you can understand the positive elements of it. And I think this is something that when you watch a lot of the cult documentaries now, like the Heaven's Gate cult documentary, the NXIVM documentary, one of the things I've noticed that they start doing is in the first episodes or in the first part of the documentary, they show positive experiences from the group, because they want to explain that these groups aren't out there completely purely bad. There are things that attract people to these groups. There are aspects of these groups that give people a sense of meaning and purpose when it works right, and when they're in that mode where they're only seeing the good stuff of it, and they haven't been exposed to things that may be in the shadows. And so I think hearing you say that you understand that there are those two different sides is good, because we understand you're not going into this as a complete babe in the woods. And so that's where Chris, for me, is really helpful, because I'm kind of like the person you described, where I have never really lived Scientology, but I think there's something valuable, because there are things like love bombing. You've heard of love bombing, right, Cardin?
That sounds either incredibly vulgar, or it sounds like a drug that you do at Burning Man in the middle of the desert.
Okay. Well, this is great, because you've probably then experienced something that you did not know, that there is it's so stereotypical, it's almost a joke, but it's so common in groups that appeal to people, get them to come in and to feel comfortable and to feel love and feel a sense of belonging. And it's this concept called love bombing. Now, Chris, love bombing would have probably been something that you would have become familiar with in your education and that. How would you define or describe love bombing?
I can look it up right here. It's an attempt to influence a person by demonstrations of attention and affection. I'm curious. I wanted to ask a couple of questions real fast, because one of the main criticisms being leveled here is that the context is all wrong. We got it all wrong. We framed it all wrong. You guys are just wrong because you just didn't even understand what we were doing there. We were just there to have fun and find out the truth. Cool. You were there to find out the truth. You were there to have fun. Great. I have a couple questions. Did you get an auditing session?
No.
Cool. Did you take a class?
It was a Sunday, so I was aware that classes weren't really particularly being offered.
I'm sorry?
When we were there, they spoke about they spoke to us, and we asked about that. Like, we've heard Will Smith, for example, commonly had said he'd overcome stage fright because of like a communications class offered at Scientology. And in a lot of these documentaries, when people go to expose Scientology, they oftentimes have the obligatory good thing that you have to mention, and they'll oftentimes mention different celebrities that have said they were helped by certain classes. Yeah. So I'm aware that there was a culture of offering classes, and we asked about that, and they informed us that, usually on Sundays, that ain't really, at least that Sunday, they weren't offering them, but they did offer to schedule us to come back if we wanted to. I found them very cordial, and they did say they walked in, and part of the reason why we did call them is because love bombing. I get what you're saying now when you say love bombing. I thought our best chance of getting the most raw and real life experience and not get love bombed by their best and brightest would be if we just showed up. And you know what? We just showed up, and the guy, I remember his name was Peter Davis. He was a very cordial guy. He walked in, he asked us to put on a mask. I could tell they were under a lot of scrutiny there. And
well, Cardin, I want to capture, because you're describing now some of the stuff that we're going to see in your commentary. So I want to make sure we capture the narrative that you gave, because you gave a chronological narrative.
Yeah.
But it sounds like, Chris, did you? Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I have to finish asking a couple questions here just to establish things. So you went into one of the 9 organizations on that street. Which one did you go into?
The one where the giant Scientology one. I mean, the main one. It's
the big blue building with a name on it that is on the thumbnail for this video.
I was about to say, I believe I put the pictures of us, because I took a couple of pictures with my iPhones and everything. And also, having been experienced with this, I know the last thing any kind of organization that's in any kind of controversial limelight wants is members of the media they do not know walking in and taking pictures. So I was trying to be as respectful as possible, because as much as the Scientologist zeitgeist permits all kinds of just like, oh, well, they're Scientologists and I know what people have said about them, we have a tendency to dehumanize people, but this is their faith and I wanted to be respectful. So I said, hey, just so you know, my name's Cardin. I'm radio host at FM 98.1, and I'm kind of interested in just getting a raw first experience of what it's like. So would you be cool with me taking some pictures? And they kind of basically said, you know what, you could take some pictures here because you kind of already have, and we're in the lobby, that's fine. But we'd appreciate it if you just didn't, because I'm sure I'm not the first person who wanted to get an expose on them that faked I was a nice guy in the very beginning. So I just was respectful of that and said, okay, cool. Well, while we're going through, can you connect me with your PR person? And they gave us a 2 or 3 hour tour. I found everybody very cordial. I met the PR person who ended up being the vice president, who was cordial. And
Chris, any follow-up question from that?
A lot of follow-up questions. So I just wanted to have him finish. So basically, you went to the Scientology base. You walked into one of the organizations. You don't know which one.
I'll tell you right now, it's the one by the brick road. One when you turn right into the brick road, and it's their main. It's where the public goes. I mean, it's their visit. It's the one that says like welcome.
Okay, there are 5 organizations on that street where public go.
Okay, here.
So
I'll show you the picture.
I'm kind of like a little dumbfounded that you didn't even know that.
Well, Chris, if I was going with only Mormon knowledge and I said I wanted to visit Scientology, I'd probably go to the big building that I saw. I'd find if there was a sign that said visitor center or something, I would just follow the sign and then go into that building. And in all likelihood, wouldn't know that there were even multiple organizations. I would just go to the one that seemed the most visible and the most inviting.
I understand. I'm just making a point that there are 9 organizations on that street. 5 of them are public service organizations. And I still don't know which one this guy walked into, but that's fine.
Is it fair to say that there's one that's the biggest visitor center?
I'll assume it was the Los Angeles organization, because that's the big
blue building. It was in LA, and it was the big blue building that you see in all the documentaries. There's only one big blue Scientologist building.
Chris, are there multiple organizations in that blue building, each of which have their own front door, or is there only one in that blue building?
Yeah, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 buildings on that property. So
those buildings are part of that campus where the blue
it's not all
building
one
is.
building. And
those service organizations you're talking about, do they all go by the name Scientology, or do they have names that seem unrelated, that seem just like, oh, it's just Al-Anon or whatever?
Here's what you've got. You've got the Los Angeles organization. You have the American St. Hill organization. You have the Advanced Organization of Los Angeles. Those are your 3 main organizations there. And those are the main public servicing organizations. The LA organization, the Los Angeles organization, would be the lower level one, the one you'd want to walk into, because that's your intro services and beginning stuff. But that street represents a path that you can follow literally as you walk down the street of organizations. from the beginning of Scientology all the way to its highest levels. So that's why I was curious which one they walked into, because if they'd have a very vastly different experience if they walked into the advanced organization versus the lower level.
Really?
You know, it says, welcome Scientology of Los Angeles. I'm looking at the picture right now.
Yeah, it was probably the Los Angeles organization, and that's probably where they would have directed you anyway. I was just curious about the experience of it. But you went in, you didn't take a class, you didn't get an auditing session. So basically what you did is you got a...
Well, yes and no. I mean, we did do the e-meter thing.
That's okay, that's fine.
Every member of us, we spent...
Be part of the tour.
I'm sure whatever curriculum was going to be in a formal 2-hour class was probably given us in whatever 2 or 3 hour experience we had there. All of us got to try the e-meter.
It wasn't. And the fact that you would say that indicates to me that you're just tossing off facts as though you know what you're talking about, and you don't.
No, I'm not tossing off facts. I'm relating an experience.
Okay, Cardin, you just said, I'm sure that anything that would have been given in a formal 2-hour class would have been given to me. But since you don't know what would be given in a formal 2-hour class, then that's a statement from ignorance that you can't really defend. And Chris is just saying that he knows what's in those classes. And so it sounds like a statement from ignorance. And I think you can acknowledge that, okay? And so I want to get back on the rail of, let's focus, before we move on to the next segment of your video. Chris, is there any information? And now, Chris, I can understand bristling at the fact that it seems like Cardin has a superficial knowledge of Scientology, but is making a bunch of claims that seem to outweigh the knowledge that he's displaying.
Correct.
But he admittedly is going into this as a complete layperson who only has the cultural gestalt of what Scientology is. And so I'm willing to give him the space of that. We're going to call it ignorance, not as an insult, just as a fact that there's a lot of information that he only has a subset, just like anyone who's non-Mormon only has a subset of Mormonism.
Sure.
So with that ground laid, is there any other info that you would want to have before we move to the next segment, or is it time to go to the next segment?
Let's go ahead and see how this plays. I guess I just wanted to clarify what the experience was, so I would know what to ask and not ask. Because
and I think that's going to be clear as he keeps talking here, because he's going to give kind of a narrative. Okay, so that's great. Let's keep going here.
I mean,
okay, first impressions, Brad, hit me.
They were just awesome. Like the people that we talked to were just so kind and like genuinely committed to doing anything that they could to help us to be happier, better people by the time we left. It was really, really intriguing to see and to like almost feel like what it would be like to be at a visitor center of the church and being approached by missionaries there. That's really what it felt like. But they were just super sincere. Every person that I spoke to was really, really cool, and just really engaged in like saying, hey, here's what we believe and here's how we think it could help you in your life.
And here's the thing. So everyone's always talking about, Cardin, you're in.
Yeah.
Everyone's always talking about Scientology's crazy and such and such and such. But here's the reality. Whenever the entire world is united in a narrative about something, I want to know, because I started doing this thing where I was like, you know what? Are we okay? We're good?
Yeah, we're good.
Oh, weird. I guess this. Okay. Whenever the whole world is like something's bad, I want to know why. So I've started reading authors that people say you shouldn't read, and let me tell you, David Icke and some of these people I've been reading make some really interesting points. And the best thing about Scientology is the fact that they're the only.
All right.
Are you kidding me right now, David Icke? Are you kidding me?
Okay, well, good. Chris, come on. We don't know the context. You got to tell us the context. First of all,
dude, you take all of Kwaku's baits, Chris.
Wow.
You live up to every Gen Xer angry middle-aged podcast.
Jordan, calm down. I told him about Kwaku. I told him you can never tell when he's being edgelord, troll bait.
Kwaku.
Okay, hold on a second.
David,
Cardin, hold up. Cardin, I don't. Okay, I have to admit that I was approached by David Icke's representative like early in my podcasting to try to set up something, but then I was like, it was creepy. He was trying to charge money or something like that. But
I don't know.
I think it was him or somebody. I forget. But Chris, fill us in on who David Icke is? Because I have no clue.
David Icke is a conspiracy theorist.
Okay.
He's the guy. You ever heard about lizard people from, blood, who drink the blood of people, and the Queen of England is one.
I immediately rescind my prior story. I'm thinking of someone else that approached me. It wasn't him.
John, this is actually part of the reason why we went down there. Chris, I've actually
Cardin.
Well, I'm just saying,
get derailed. You've already shown that you're going to derail this conversation if I let you go. So is this relevant to the topic?
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, I know nothing of David Icke, but I've seen over the past 2 years in my adult life, every conspiracy theory, whether it was lab leak or Jeffrey Epstein or whatever, get vilified a year before it ends up being front page news. So
not every conspiracy theory, because flat Earth is a conspiracy theory.
Not everyone, but I've seen a significant amount of those, enough that it gives me pause, and I no longer take the wholesale dismissal of, you can't listen to him because he's a conspiracy theory. Hence the reason we decided to have our own experience in the Scientology building, because the same attitude of dismissal towards the people that ended up being proven right about Jeffrey Epstein and proven right about many of the original origins of coronavirus or the science behind it or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those people that were wholesale dismissed in the exact same way Chris just dismissed David Icke, who I know nothing of, other than I've maybe heard like 5 sound bites that Kwaku showed.
So Cardin, I want to summarize your position, which is that there are conspiracy theories. Some of them have been proven true, or aspects of them are true, even when people didn't believe them. And so that gives you a seed that justifies, as Kwaku said, when you hear everybody against something, at least look into it. And that was the impulse there. Now, Chris, is there any merit to that argument, or is there a missing component that you see as relevant here?
Apply it to the Nazis and tell me how legitimate that argument is.
Okay,
I see the whole world against something. I know there's something up there, and I better go check it out.
And so the second you read Mein Kampf, by Hitler, it becomes drastically apparent that you're dealing with somebody who has an unrealistic view of Jewish world conspiracy control.
Okay. So Chris has mentioned that David Icke has posited conspiracies about lizard people. And you might say that something that is that outlandish would kind of undermine the credibility of him in a broader sense. And I think there's some merit to that argument. When somebody starts making claims that are so outrageous that they lose all credibility, then that speaks to that.
Well, let me please clarify that David Icke was somebody, along with Alex Jones, whose material I used to use when I was a Sea Org member to recruit people to join the Sea Org.
Wait, how?
You're salty towards David Icke. Or wait.
Hold on, Chris, let him finish here.
I will finish. I've actually made an entire video about this. I have detailed exactly how we used Alex Jones and David Icke's conspiracy theories and even their DVDs and written materials to scare people, to get people into a headspace where they were convinced that the world was about to end, and it was only Scientology that was bringing about the salvation of the planet. Until I found out about David Icke and the lizard people. And then David Icke was actually too crazy for me to use as a Scientologist.
Okay.
Stop using David Icke in recruiting people for Scientology. Okay. And you have not even begun to plumb the depths of the crazy of Scientology. So when I say something like that, I go, David Icke is too crazy for Scientology. That should mean something. Anyway, that's my experience with David Icke in a nutshell. I could go on for hours about the guy.
I think that's enough for that. Now, it might be worth talking about what you're saying that you used to do in Scientology. Was one of the tactics that cults would use would be we need to find some way to undermine somebody's trust in their own cognitive abilities so that we can start to pour our own ideology uncritically into their mind. We've got to dissolve some of the boundaries that they may have. So if we can cause a distrust of science, cause a distrust of the media, if we can, I guess, exaggerate things that may break down those barriers of truth, then it allows them to be more vulnerable to accepting my own particular ideology. And it sounds like that's kind of what you were doing. You were bringing up all these different conspiracies or end of the world claims that would use both fear and uncertainty in order to make somebody more likely to accept the new, saving ideology that you had as a Scientologist. And you could see how that can apply to other contexts. Now, Cardin, do you understand how a group trying to manipulate and get inside somebody's head would find that tactic valuable? I'm not talking about Scientology. I'm just talking about as a general principle.
Yeah, I think that's cruel to do that to people. And
okay, so then that tells you that there's the question of whether or not something is true, whether or not you can empirically prove or disprove, or like those things are important because they help you to defend against that type of manipulation. And so there's a legitimate concern with things like journalism and the academic world losing credibility because it makes the wider public more vulnerable to this, which is why we may see more people turning to some of these conspiracy theories because they've lost faith in the things that they could otherwise trust in.
We're watching that happen in real time. I mean, the only institution in the United States of America that has a lower approval rating, according to Rasmussen right now, lower approval rating than Congress, is the American mainstream media. I mean, that you can't get more abysmally low than the trust rating of the American media right now. So yeah.
No, I agree. So we're in agreement on this principle that it's important to have institutions and ways of thinking about things that can discern for truth from error, and defending that is good. So I think that's just a theme that we can keep in mind going forward. Now, before Kwaku mentioned David Icke, Beardy Head Brad talked about, and he's like almost glowing, there's heaven rays about how great the experience was. Now, Chris, can you, he's saying that he felt like, just in their visit there, they did everything so that he could feel better about his life just when he left at that one visit. What would a Scientologist, is that their goal? Like when somebody comes in out of the street, I can't imagine going into a place and having somebody try to affect me like that.
Well, this particular visit was a media visit.
Do they categorize him?
He announced himself as a radio DJ right at the get-go, right?
I'm not sure. Cardin, did you mention that you were in the media?
No, not right at the get-go. I let it be a natural experience first, and then once I met the guy and I realized we've got our guy now. That's when I said, hey, can we do this?
Okay. How long did that take?
5 to 10 minutes of interaction. I wanted to make sure that whatever person I would be interviewing, and by the way, it's not like a lot of this was premeditated and planned. Mm-hmm. A lot of it just kind of happened in real time. Mm-hmm. But what I knew I didn't want was interacting with somebody who's, at the front door and the raw, authentic person I would deal with as a layman walking in, and then announcing myself as a radio host and then getting assigned the better, brighter version. No, I wanted to get the raw experience. So I went in there and I was point blank saying, hey, look, we're just looky-loos. I've driven by here a million times. I'm not coming for a specific class. We're literally just a walk-in. What can we see today? And we were introduced to our first two. We looked around and I realized, okay, these are the two people I would have dealt with if I were to come in raw and fresh as a layman off the street. Mm-hmm. And after having developed that rapport with them, I said, okay, cool. Well, look, besides just being a looky-loo, I'm also somebody who'd like to grab some content if I can. Here's my credentials. Would you be interested? They have a policy that's, you got to push it to the higher ups first. So they pushed it to the higher ups, and then the higher ups graciously gave their permission for me to talk to the ones I met with that I would have met with were I a layman. So I feel like I did as best I could to get an opportunity to show our audience what being a layman walking in on a cold call would be like.
But you didn't, because you announced within 5 minutes of being there that you were a media personality.
Yes, but again, I wasn't going for the truth and the perfect experience. I was going for the best experience a media guy can have, because as a radio host, I'm aware I will never get, if you're a celebrity and you walk through the front door, you're immediately going to be assigned the best dude. So I walked in there, you know what I'm saying? I walked in there and I developed a relationship with who my guy would have been. And then I told that guy, hey, I have a podcast, not a big deal, but it's a radio show and a podcast. And if I can, I'd like to interview you because I found you to be genuine and honest. And I think this would be good content. I mean, I talked with the guy for I'd probably say I'd talked to the guy for about 5 minutes before announcing that I was a media personality, enough that I felt comfortable that he was acting in good faith.
Chris, tell us, is there a difference there in terms of?
Well, there's a huge difference. That's what I'm trying to establish, and I still can't really get a straight answer here. So you walk in there, and it's like, oh, here's this guy who's talking pleasantly to me. He's honest. I'll go with him. And it seems as though there was just an uncritical acceptance of everything that was told to you, and you pass this on as, well, they were nice people. Clearly, they were honest people, even though you have absolutely no idea whether that's true or not. And so you pass this on as though, well, we had a pleasant experience there, so therefore all the critics are wrong. Like, I really am not tracking with this logic.
Yeah,
Carden, to clarify that, Carden, because I think I can see the root of this disconnect here, which is that you guys intentionally, specifically went there without the intention of bringing up every criticism that you've ever heard. You just wanted to see, kind of like if you take off all the breaks and just say, okay, I'm going to go in and just say yes and nod to every time, kind of like that documentary where the guy was like, every time McDonald's tells me if I want extra fries, I'm just going to say yes. So you're just went and then
supersize me,
supersize me. Yeah, you're just going in. It's just whatever they tell me, I'm going to accept uncritically just to have what that experience would be like.
This is like, so Chris, you and I are going to get along really well, and I will give you the key to this conversation. I did not engage, and this is what I take issue, and this is what I bristle at, John. I didn't uncritically accept. There is an insane amount of arrogance in that statement. I actually very critically accepted my situation, and this was the critique that I gave it before accepting it. I understood that as a media personality, okay, the best I could get at having a layman's firsthand experience of going to the Church of Scientology would to be go in, cold call, so they don't know that the media is coming, talk to a guy and establish a relationship with him as a layman, and then hope for the best that once I speak to them and say, I'd like to record you for a podcast, that I'm allowed to get that person and not get dished off on the person that usually deals with the media and gives the love bombing and gives the pat answers and talking points. So I actually very critically analyzed my situation in that short 5 minutes and thought the best situation and the closest I will come to giving my audience an authentic cold call experience on the Church of Scientology in a respectful and ethical way would be by dealing this way with these people that I met and then announcing myself in the way that I did so that I can talk to the people with whom I talked with. And the best part is they graciously accepted and have allowed me to schedule next time Brad and Kwaku come down an interview with both Sea Org members that we met. We didn't get pawned off on anybody. We didn't get kidnapped and put in a van. The worst rumors of Scientology that you're going to get,
Carden, before we go there though, okay, I think you laid out your philosophy on this quite well. Now, Chris, hold on, Carden, I gotta make sure I structure this discussion. Now, Chris, you just heard Carden lay out his philosophy for how he approached it. Now, without speaking to him personally, just that philosophy itself and that approach, do you think it is justified? Do you think it makes sense? Is that something that Scientology has accounted for and has a way to respond to? How would you characterize that approach? Carden, don't take it personally. He's just talking about the approach that you just articulated.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, so he just said that he knew as a radio personality, he could get the closest to an authentic experience by going in, establishing a rapport, and then introducing himself as a radio host, knowing that he's going to get a different level of treatment, but that's just kind of what he has to live with, and that he was going to approach it that way. What do you think? Is that a reasonable way to get something resembling the truth of the Scientology experience?
No.
Okay, and why, if like briefly, why is that not the best way to get the Scientology experience.
Because I'd like to hear this story from any ex-member of Scientology that they were abused within the first 5 minutes of being there.
Okay, now that's a very good point. Now, Cardin, would you agree with that point, that is, if you take people who later found themselves subject to physical, sexual, psychological abuse at the hands of Scientology and its leaders, if you asked any of them, hey, within the first 10 minutes, did you get any hint that it was a negative experience? And they said no, it was all very pleasant at the beginning. Would you agree that that's probably the case?
I 100% agree that there's a possibility, probably a probability, that any organization, when you first meet them, puts their best foot forward.
Exactly.
And the worst, and I want to clarify something here. Any of these worst rumors that we've heard of Scientology or of Mormonism or of Catholicism or of any ism out there can be true, especially if your experience is only superficial and minimal. And I think we're getting a little bit of a Lou Perez effect here. And part of my reluctance to engage in this when Kwaku was excited is there's a comedian called Lou Perez. You need to watch this video. It's called Stop Making Me Defend Donald Trump. And in the video, he's going to work and he gets into the elevator. And in the elevator, he hears somebody say something like, oh, did you hear that Donald Trump like tried to, says Nazis are great or whatever. And then Lou Perez, who doesn't like Donald Trump, says, well, actually, the quote was this. And in an effort to simply just represent what reality was, they look at him and say, you're not a Trump supporter, are you? And kick him out of the elevator. So going up the stairs, he hears somebody else say something.
So, Cardin, based on your story that you're giving here, you're giving credibility to someone who can point to the truth and saying we need to stop letting rumors and misrepresentations guide our discourse. We need to speak to the truth. Now, what I am hoping that you can acknowledge a little bit is that if you take yourself out of this discussion and acknowledge that Chris is even more experienced and invested in his experience as having been through Scientology, and has spent more time in Scientology than perhaps you spent in Mormonism, given that he's older and he actually lived more of his life in there. Just as if someone was to say, Cardin, is your experience in Mormonism your legitimate experience? You'd say, yeah, it is. I can tell you what it's like to be a Mormon in my experience. He's telling us what it's like to be a Scientologist in his experience.
Great.
And so I want to extend to him the authenticity of that experience through this discussion. And as much as I know that you want to say that the experience that you had was pleasant, you've already acknowledged that there's a disconnect between what organizations may bring at the front and what their true lived reality is for people who see their darkest parts. So I'd like to continue the narrative here and see if we can learn anything from his experience contrasted with the green experience that you guys got on first go.
Yeah, the only one sentence correction I would say to that is, I'm here to defend and relate what our experience was. I'm not here to defend the Church of Scientology.
Well, I think that's a great theme for us to guide the future discussions. And you can say, my experience was great, but then that also allows for Chris to say, yeah, that's how they will always treat everyone. But if you don't know where that leads to at the end of the walkway, at the end of the path, then you may be misled or misguided, or you may be misrepresenting to your audience something that is inherently dangerous and that you wouldn't want to normalize.
I'm not misrepresenting anything other than my own 3-hour experience. And that's where people lose their minds, and my reluctance to engage in telling these stories sometimes, because it seems like even in this conversation, I haven't been able to correct the record and say, I'm defending my retelling of my experience without that becoming some kind of defense of Scientology. I admit I haven't been a Scientologist for 13 years like Chris has. And if he's got some expertise to bring to that table, great. I'm not here to defend the Church of Scientology. I'm here to simply properly represent what my own experience was, that thus far has been good.
Okay. Well, that's fair enough. So you're saying that people who have just had a very brief encounter with Scientology in their visitor center will likely come away with something that's kind of positive. And if we can contrast that experience with what somebody who actually is raised in the group may experience, then I think there can be some valuable information there, just showing that groups can have different, you'll experience something differently on a superficial drive-by than you will on actually living and breathing that life. So let's move to the next segment here.
Only church with the spine and cojones to call out Big Pharma, and they do it extensively with a lot of gusto. Big Pharma is incredibly corrupt. They're consistently poisoning people. We have documented evidence of this, and they're the only ones who call it out. And they go after the really corrupt practices that are found in psychiatry, which is also something people don't talk about. And there's a lot of death and destruction from a trail with the trail of historical psychiatry. So if there's one group that will come after you, make you look crazy if you go after them, it is Big Pharma. So I'm not convinced they're as crazy as people say. I'm not saying all their practices are moral and right, but I am saying you can't write them off just because a journalist said, oh no, these are the bad guys. Because you know what? Filling children with serotonin reuptake inhibitors, poisoning their food, and making them mentally imbalanced and unstable is the norm, and almost no Christian church has done anything about it. Half of those pastors are cheating on their wives, and their kids are addicted to porn and are freaking drugged up. And so I'm saying maybe the Scientologists actually have some stuff to write about, and we should listen to them and not just go, oh, Xenu. Like, maybe there's some actual truth.
Yeah.
And
Okay. So Kwaku hit on a couple of things that if you've watched the Prison of Belief documentary, Cardin, have you watched that documentary all the way through yet?
Yeah, I've actually watched pretty much every documentary on Scientology possible.
Okay. So, Chris, what is he talking about in terms of how Scientology treats both psychiatry and the pharmaceutical industry?
Scientology is rabidly anti-psychiatry as a dogmatic point. L. Ron Hubbard hated psychiatry because it rejected Dianetics back in 1949 when he offered to, give it to them, or at least that's what he claimed. There's actually no proof that he did that, but he had a real stick in his craw about psychiatry. And in 1950, he was well justified in having that stick in his craw because psychiatry was then pretty brutal practice. Lobotomies, transorbital leucotomies, lithium, men in lab coats. That was psychiatry all in 1950. I've got all kinds of critical things to say about psychiatry. However, Scientology does not offer, and this is really the important part, Scientology does not offer anything that is any better than psychiatry in the treatment of mental illness or mental health. They do not acknowledge that there is any such thing as a chemical problem or a neurotransmitter problem. It's all spiritual, all of it, 100% of the time. That's not true either. So you have a problem because their treatment modality for handling people who are having psychotic episodes in Scientology is to lock them up and isolate them and not talk with them and not care for them. And the most classic known case of this that was very publicly displayed was Lisa McPherson in the mid-90s. And that happened, and that woman died in Scientologist care while they were carrying out L. Ron Hubbard's explicit instructions on how to deal with somebody who's having a psychotic episode. So, does Scientology get it right that psychiatry has shortcomings and problems in its history and in its application of, psychotropic medications? Yeah, they do. Does Scientology get it right that psychiatry should be eradicated from the planet and all psychiatrists basically locked up in prison as war criminals? No, they don't get that right. But if you go to the CCHR, the Citizens Commission on Human Rights website, which is a Scientology front group established in 1969 with the sole purpose of eradicating psychiatry from the face of the planet, that's the kind of propaganda you'll see. They have numerous documentaries where they tell lie after lie after lie after lie about current psychiatric practices. So much so that the legitimate anti-psychiatry movement the psychiatry reform movement that exists in the United States and internationally doesn't want to have anything to do with CCHR because they are so extreme. That's the situation with psychiatry and Scientology.
Okay.
So, you know, it's not a matter of it's kind of, well, my enemy's enemy is my friend kind of thing here. And that's not good logic. And Scientology does not have anything.
Suggesting that I'm saying the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
I got that. I'm just saying that Scientology doesn't have anything approximating an alternative to psychiatry. They just want to get rid of it. And their solutions and their proposals for what would replace psychiatry are actually worse. So that's the point I'm trying to make here.
I see. It's kind of like, I don't know, the logical structure of Kweku's statement right there doesn't really make sense, because you can point to problems either in, as he does in psychiatry and big pharma, or even into the wider Christian world where, you know, pastors are having affairs or something like that. Just because you can point out a problem in some sort of thing doesn't mean that you should completely demonize and discard the thing as a whole, or that the alternative that the person who's pointed it out is offering as a replacement is better on the other end. It's just using problems as a cudgel for making a particular point. Right. Cardin, anything about, if you've already watched the documentaries on Scientology, then you would have already been familiar with the history of L. Ron Hubbard's Dianetics, the fact that he tried to use it as this new miraculous mental health cure, and that the rejection by the mental health industry that was moving towards evidence-based practices that have allowed for reform and discarding some of the old harmful practices. You would be familiar with all that history. So any additional thing that you would add to the dimension of Kweku's statement there?
Yeah, I would just say that if everything that Chris says is true, that a church dismissed legitimate proven medical treatment,
they did
I very much believe in. Okay, I mean, my daughter was saved by modern medicine. I have leukemia. I take an oral chemotherapy pill that keeps me alive. I'm very much a proponent and a believer in modern medicine. Okay, and if a church withheld legitimate and accessible and affordable care from somebody who sought it against their will, that's one of the worst human rights violations I can think of. Okay. At the same time, this is part of the reason why we went down there to see for ourselves. I'm reluctant to take as fact from the same man that only 30 minutes ago was calling me nonsensical and an apologist for, cult apologia and all this. I'm reluctant to take as fact what he says is fact about a church, when even just in my 1 hour personal experience with him, I've been accused of everything from apologetics of an organization I'm not associated with to being uncritical in my acceptance of the world around me.
Now, Cardin, hold on a second, because you stepped over the line of the world of Mormonism into the world of Scientology, which means that you are now subject to the response to your rhetoric from people who have their own experience in it. Now, if you put yourself in Chris's shoes, and if somebody was coming to you, and I don't know, if, like, let's say that your daughter had, gotten swept up by the Jehovah's Witnesses or something, and then eventually got out, and then was posed with something similar to what Chris is being posed with, there's this defensiveness mechanism that kicks in that I know it's hard to avoid. And I think, to Chris's credit, and I've encountered it too when I have other people, I try not to point to it the whole time. So I understand that it hurts to hear those statements about what your motives or what your thought or what your critical capabilities are, but just try to, I'm just asking you to just hold on to that defensiveness for a little bit, let it stew, and let's listen to the
defensive. I'm simply saying, this is my psychology. I take what you say with pause, because unprovoked, you accuse me of things I know I'm not guilty of. Therefore, when you accuse the church of something I haven't seen myself, I'm a little bit more interested in seeing myself than taking your word for it.
Okay,
That-
and so that level of skepticism is understandable, and so I think, yeah. Well, let's keep going. All right, here we go.
Brad has a personal story with some Scientologists.
Yeah, so Scientologists actually saved my uncle from a heroin addiction, is the way that my dad has put it for me. And so I was curious to learn more details about like how it is that they would go about doing that, and the kind of things that they believe, and the things they hold dear. Because I honestly think that there's like truth in every religion, right? But it's really cool to see it in Scientology as we're talking to them and as they're explaining to us what they believe. And it's just cool to see the light in their eyes as they like testify of the truths that they do know to us. It was awesome. It was so cool to be on the other end of that, you know?
Okay, interesting.
Okay, so Cardin,
Let me just
yeah,
please
go ahead, Chris.
a little bit more context here for Cardin, so that maybe he might understand a little bit more why I have this look on my face when I watch a friend of his say things like that about Scientology. The place that you went was where I lived for 17 years. The big blue buildings, that's a Sea Org base. That was my world. There were months, actually, there was a period of 3 years where I was not allowed to leave that base without the company of 2 other people to make sure that I was kept under control and didn't take off on my own. That's the level of control I was placed under while I lived and worked there. I was enslaved on that block. I lived in a basement for 3 years there. I didn't see the light of day for about 6 months at a time, because I was a dedicated, glowy-eyed, hardcore Scientologist who believed that we were saving the world. I allowed myself to be enslaved there. And I use the term I allowed myself advisedly. It was my responsibility. And yet, people who are victimized don't get victimized all by themselves, do they? Those things happen to me whether you choose to believe it or not. I was physically assaulted there. Physically assaulted. That happened to me, whether you choose to believe it or not. So I have been in the position of the tour guide, and I've been in the position of the prisoner in the basement. Both of them are valid Scientology experiences. My problem with your entire attitude in this podcast and today is that you seem wholly and completely uninterested in hearing anything negative. All you want to do is defend your positive 3 hours on that base as though you know something. And that's my problem with this. So just to give you a little bit more context of my lived experience with Scientology that you should take as valid, just as I'm supposed to sit here and take your 3 hours of experience as valid. I do. You did have a valid, pleasant experience with Scientologists, and that's great. But to think you know something about it as a result of that, and to just dismiss critics out of hand, which you and your friends did, quite loudly and repeatedly.
That's a misrepresentation.
The part that I find quite disgusting. And I am disgusted by it because I've lived an experience that is radically different from your glowing report of Scientology. So if you're wondering why I have this kind of negative attitude about this right now, it's because that's what you're creating in me with your attitude, okay? So I just got to be open about that because it really, really pisses me off. So,
Chris, I thanks for sharing that. Now, Cardin, there's a metaphor that like I've been trying to find the right metaphor for this, and something, you know, if you were to find somebody who was a complete psychopathic abuser of children, but the way that they lured the children is by giving them a piece of candy, and then somebody went in and the person goes and hands candy to multiple people, but then the people who come and do more with him when he gets the candy are the ones that get victimized. And somebody else says, well, I'm going to, there's these rumors about this guy handing candy out that he really hurts people, but I went and I got a piece of candy and it's no big deal. Look, everybody, this candy is great. The guy giving candy is fine.
You think
hold on, let me finish this, okay?
Possibly.
So you'd have to listen to the people who were actually victimized by the person who was handing out the candy.
I have
to realize that that is the issue. And so then you could maybe understand why somebody who's seen somebody else saying, hey, this candy's great, go get the candy from the guy, or it's okay for this guy to be handing out candy, is going to be a problem.
I understand.
Something that they would want to respond to and not feel comfortable or pleasant about. Does that make sense?
I understand the analogy. I understand that my 3 hours are not 30 years. I don't feel I've represented my 3 hours as 30 years.
Okay, and then do you understand his point about the glowing review that Brad just gave about these excellent people of Scientology? Do you understand why that in and of itself is dangerous?
Yes, and I would encourage him to talk to Brad about that, see what happened with his brother. Once again, I am not here to defend the Church of Scientology. I am here to defend my representation of my 3 hours.
So and you're here to defend holding up the piece of candy and saying, this isn't that bad. People should go and try some of that candy.
When did I say people should go try some of that candy?
Well, we're going to find out. Because that was the whole
this is like
here.
You're already accusing me of things I haven't done, and the Lou Perez effect is kicking in. Simply because I went down and had a good faith engagement with a controversial organization, I'm now getting lumped in with that controversial organization by its worst critics and being accused of everything from being a doe-eyed, ignorant person to being a nonsensical to being all kinds of other things that I know for a fact I'm not. And Chris, if you were abused by an organization that was abusing its power, that is a human rights violation that should be addressed to the fullest extent of the law. If the Church of Scientology indeed has a religious practice under the guise of religious practice of not allowing people freedom of association, which is a constitutionally protected freedom, by controlling them with other members of their faith monitoring them, then that is a human rights violation that needs to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I don't know how more emphatically I can say this. I agree with you if that's the issue. I take issue with you jumping the shark saying I'm defending these people. I'm not. I'm not defending anything that happened to you. I'm not a poster boy, an apologist, or a representative of the Church of Scientology. The only thing I'm representing was a humorous and fun impromptu trip that we took on a Sunday afternoon to a Church of Scientology headquarters that's 20 minutes from my house.
Okay, so Chris, or Cardin, you're not defending Scientology. You are putting a spotlight on positive aspects of Scientology that would be enticing and inviting to others. Okay, and that's not defending Scientology. That's putting a spotlight on the good parts of Scientology. Would you put the spotlight on the good parts of somebody who enticed children with candy and subsequently abused them? Is there any merit to putting the spotlight on the fact that actually that candy is pretty good and the guy was really nice?
Okay, so now we're actually getting to some meat and potatoes and some good stuff. Okay, I went to film school. The number one rule of documentary filmmaking is that you exalt the everyday, and what you put on screen, you exalt. And I think that's a legitimate question from guys like Chris and John. If by exalting and even putting on the screen, if the worst rumors of Scientology are true, by even making a fun podcast and going down there and showing that little piece of candy, have you inadvertently become a gateway drug to other people's abuse, is what you're asking, correct, John?
I think it's a good way of summarizing
okay.
it.
So are we guilty by having highlighted our experience, okay, of becoming a gateway drug to abuse for other people? That's a very serious question that I do take serious, because I'm not a doe-eyed, unscrupulous, unthinking, illogical person. I think that. Now, were I 100% convinced that the worst rumors of Scientology were true, I wouldn't have gone down there. I wouldn't have become the gateway drug. I wouldn't have sought out my own experience. However, because the past 2 or 3 years that I've engaged with my podcast, trying to engage with ex-Mormon members of my faith, I've been subjected to cancellation and lies about personal interactions. I know that I have receipts for and screenshots for with many ex-Mormons. I have become dubious of critics and some of their worst rumors. If you believe the worst rumors about me on ex-Mormon subreddit, John, and you've read them and you know for a fact through personal interaction with me that they're not true, okay? If you were to believe those worst rumors about me, I couldn't be a human being. So, unsure who to believe, I decided to find out for myself. And as a member of the media who feels there's ethics in media and that I should represent that experience as best I could, I went down there in a way that I thought would represent it as best I could. That's literally all there is to it.
Okay, I think you stated that well. Chris, any response to that before we go into the next segment?
No.
Okay, let's take a look at where we go next.
Interesting. So for me, full disclosure, like I watched every inch of Going Clear and Scientology, the aftermath and everything. And I mean, those are some freaky claims, right? But at the same token, I mean, you see what some ex-Mormons make up about us, right? So I was like, I'm just forcing myself, eyes wide open, gonna check this out, be as unbiased as I can. So here's a little mini, not vlog, but a little picture history of us cruising down there. So we went to the main big building, all right, the big blue building that everybody sees in LA. And once we got there, I was actually surprised that we had to put on not masks, I think
gloves.
Yeah, well, and I asked him, I was like, okay, so, you know, what's this for? Is this like an internal deal or is this state, you know, required and stuff? And apparently he was just like, no, we're just trying to be really cooperative with the contact tracing, this and that. And I could tell that they were definitely on alert for not wanting to have an excuse for the state to come after them, which to a certain extent, I guess that's wise. You know what I'm saying? So fine. And they were super courteous about it though, had everything waiting at the beginning. And it became plainly obvious that they're very welcoming and want to bend over backwards to ingest anybody into their visitor center. So I appreciated that. I thought that was cool. And then we met two of the coolest young Scientologists in the land, right? You know what I'm saying? So this guy right here, that was, what was his name again, Brad? It was Peter, I believe it was, right? And then we also...
He was so cool. He was so great.
Yeah. And then we also met, not his sidekick, but another girl that works there that was super cool. That was Krista, I believe was her name, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Krista.
Dude, they were so awesome. They were just so kind and so good.
Now, they definitely did shut her down when I asked, could I take some pictures? Because I wanted to be super respectful and ask like, okay, are you down with us taking pictures? You know, because we really want to come in eyes wide open, things like that. I'm a host at, you know, FM 98.1 and I just want you to know we're not trying to make you a brunt of any joke, right? And they were just like, dude, if you're media, like you got to talk to media people and you can't just come in here guns blazing. I didn't at all want to like, you know, try and take advantage of any kind of goodwill or anything like that. So I was just like, fine, you know, we'll schedule this for later. But true to their word, man, I give these cats serious credit because I have gone in cold call to 1,000,001 institutions to try and get an interview with somebody or try and get a face-to-face with somebody or whatever, or just to see what it's like. And I've been given runaround after runaround. Like we're all used to the runaround. Oh, well, we'd like to, but you have to talk to the PR person and, oh, well, they're not available right now, which really means just you make me uncomfortable. I don't want to help you. I don't want to cooperate with you. Right. But these people said they talked to their higher ups. And they talked to their higher ups and the higher up came down and we had a good convo. And it took them a while, you know, they said like, well, it's a Sunday, you know, so it's not normal operating hours, you know, so we got to get a hold of somebody. But we met the person in charge of PR, you know, they were courteous, wanted to know what we were up to, wanted to get an idea of what we were doing. And they were fully cooperative, nothing to hide. Totally down. And I had actually a very touching and beautiful conversation. It sounds like we're all fanboying here. You know what I'm saying? But
I mean, why not?
I
like them.
They were
I bought
great.
another one of their books. I've been reading Dianetics by L. Ron Hubbard. Look, I
was a little bit disappointed in one thing though.
I can just interject.
They were like,
Yeah.
One thing that you're not aware of in all those nice people that you talk to is every one of them has been imprisoned on that base without being able to leave for the last 3 years because of COVID. The Decon 7 cleaner that they use is an industrial strength cleaner. They use it in every building on that base, and they all wear masks and gloves according to the dictates of David Miscavige, who's absolutely paranoid about catching COVID. So they have to clean their public and private areas throughout that base 7 to 8 times a day with industrial strength cleaner, which has led some Sea Org members to hospital trips for passing out, going unconscious because of the exposure. Those are the nice people that you were talking to and gushing over. They are prisoners on that base.
Okay.
And you are clueless.
I wasn't gushing. I was giving credit where credit is due.
You guys were just gushing, dude.
Can you
Hold on.
Okay, Chris, get over.
Everything I say has to be wrong according to you.
Okay, no,
One thing I can say can ever be right. You have to push back on everything. It's really exhausting.
Yeah,
Cardin, this what we just saw here reminds me. Go ahead, Chris.
Over prisoners.
Okay,
Cardin, hold on a second. You saw Going Clear. You said, and you said you've seen every documentary. Now, there was this documentary that was done with John Sweeney early on, and there was a confrontation between John Sweeney and somebody in the Scientology organization, and John Sweeney broke down and started yelling at the guy. And in that documentary, there was a lot of back and forth with somebody, Mike Rinder, who was representing Scientology and was absolutely denying everything that he was being accused of, or that the organization was being accused of, and was putting on a face of the good Scientology church, as he represented, Mike Rinder was. And we learned in later documentaries that every time we saw Mike Rinder, and he was there as the stately representative of the church, he had been taken out of imprisonment where he had been subject to physical and psychological abuse and put in that position. And he couldn't say it. All he could do was put forth a face defending the church until he escaped later. And it was only later that he actually was able to apologize and say what was happening.
I don't understand why you guys are so interested in trying to download this information as though you think I don't understand it. I'm very aware of what the worst...
If you understood it, you wouldn't have the naive response that we just heard from all three of you there.
Isn't naive. You just never let me freaking finish my sentences. I pushed back on Chris. Okay. I pushed back on Chris saying I wasn't gushing. Right before you pressed pause, I did say, hold on a second. I was disappointed with one thing. And I was about to finish. I started out with the good, and I was going to follow it up with some of the disappointments I had. But then I was actually just about to ask Chris, what's the name of this chemical? Because I am going to have a scheduled interview. And I believe, Chris, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in the 10 Commandments, the third commandment is thou shalt not take the Lord's name in vain. When God introduced man to religion, he understood the power it would have over their minds and the power that it would give men. And one of the first commandments he gave them was do not abuse this power. If the Sea Org is enslaving people against their will, disallowing them from freedom of association, and causing, through religious scrupulosity, chemicals to be introduced to their life that's causing them to go to the freaking hospital for emergency room visits, that is a human rights violation. And as a member of the media, I am on your side. And if you could stop for a second trying to convince me that I'm a doe-eyed ignoramus who's naive to the worst claims of the church, I would gladly like to start writing down some of these chemicals and some of these accusations. So during my interview with the people with whom I now have rapport, I can address some of these issues. I'm not an apologist of Scientology. Will you please get that through?
Okay, Chris.
If I
the
might,
chemical. Go ahead.
Two things. Thing number one, the chemical is called Decon 7. It's the only one they use.
No, we're missing him.
The second thing I'd like you to please spend some time learning about is this little thing called coercive control and cognitive dissonance.
I was a psychology minor. I'm very aware.
Cool. Motivated reasoning.
Very aware.
Then why is it that you seem to believe that you're going to go talk to this level of Scientologist and get anything approximating the truth about what I just told you about Decon 7 and human rights violations there? When I was a Scientologist on that base, at the lowest low of my experience, I would never, ever have told you anything like what I just said about my experience there. I would tell you nothing but the most glowing review of Scientology because I'm a true believer.
And I understand that.
Then you understand what that state of mind is. It's an uncritical state of mind. It's incapable of critical thinking on that topic.
So I think this comes from a fundamental misunderstanding. By the way, I only interrupted you because you were starting to digitize and I could no longer hear what you were saying, Chris. I didn't mean to be rude. But I think this comes from a fundamental misunderstanding of what the purpose of our project going down to the Scientology building was. This is not an apologist's defense of Scientology. It's not even an attempt to say, hey, Mormons and Scientologists, we're bros. We're both misunderstood. See? No, it was literally just to have an experience for ourselves in which I can experience firsthand what having the most amount of experience I can possible in the limited time I have, a firsthand interaction with a Scientologist, where I will ask them the hard questions, and I will also ask them about the rumors, the good stuff, the human things. I want to humanize these people because they are actual real human beings. And as somebody who's only trying to represent his own experience, I will take those experiences and then do my best so I really do understand what the truth of Scientology really is, okay? Juxtapose those with all the information I can get. Now, if the Church of Scientology is so coercive and secretive that the worst rumors about them can only be found once you've been in there for 10 years, I'm probably not going to be able to verify those rumors. I'm aware. Okay. However, I also have become very familiar with evil as a member of the media for a decade. I've reported on all kinds of evil and secretive organizations. Okay. Things always slip. Things always slip. So if these horrible accusations that you make, that I think many of these lived experiences were true because I believe a lot of these people that have said it, they won't be able to hide it for long. So I'm not going to be some great expose person. Okay. I'm not here to defend the church either. I'm simply here to say what my real experience is. Mm-hmm. That's it.
Okay, Cardin, I got two things I want to say before we go to the next one. The first one is I'm going to assume that at the end of your journey, what is probably going to be the case is just what Chris is alluding to, is that nobody is going to validate any of the darkest rumors, we'll call them rumors, about what happens in Scientology when you go through official channels. And so that all that leaves you with is the people who have survived, come out, and now are free of the psychological control, which enables them to talk about what actually happened.
Right.
And if you take one data point, one person, then there's still reason to be skeptical because that could be just somebody with a chip on their shoulder. But when you have hordes of people who come out, who are now relating their experience in it, and all of those experiences have a consistency and a reproducibility where people are like, yeah, that happened to me too. This happened, this happened. And that's where the value of taking both Scientology and the Prison of Belief, as well as the Leah Remini, as well as all the other documentaries that have come out, as well as Chris Shelton as a podcaster, and the other former Scientologists like Mike Rinder, who are talking about it. And they all point to a coherent, consistent narrative about what life is like in the secretive inner workings of the group. Now, there's some validity to that consistency, which if you're not getting the straight dope from the official sources, you have to confront. Now they're hoping that you'll confront it before you go and try to get and end up and getting misled. But it's understandable that you're going to have a degree of skepticism and you want to get both sides as a journalist or just as an individual. That's
Now,
the first thing.
Just
Go
to
ahead.
reassure you, just to reassure you, I even took that into consideration. And I think it was fair, the distance that I put between Brad and Kwaku and I specifically had my own unique experience when I went there. I was not in the same group with Brad and Kwaku. They all had their experience. And fortunately,
they split you guys up?
no. They didn't split us up. I chose to go a different direction. Okay. By the way, I'm 6'6", 285 pounds. Both your buddies, Chris, when you were in the Sea Org, it might have taken 3 of you. I'm fine going alone into that building. Okay. Trust me, I'm not worried about it.
They're not after your physical body, Cardin. They're after your mind.
But I'm not worried about getting kidnapped or whatever. Okay. Now, with that said, okay. Oh, shoot. I forgot where I was going.
Well, okay. Let me get my last point in. Okay. Because you bring up a point that should be like the call sign of everyone trying to fight these groups, which is that if somebody has been held against their will, or if they've done this or that against their will by this organization. And the thing is, once you make a study of coercive control, psychological manipulation, undue influence, totalism, all these different names for these, what we'll call, cultic behaviors, you'll see that what they do is they exploit normal human psychological vulnerabilities and end up robbing an individual of their agency, of their ability to make a free choice by implanting an ideology that completely distorts their perceptions of reality and the milieu in which they make their choice.
Yeah,
and so somebody doesn't understand, like when Chris says he was there as a voluntary participant, that's because his mind had been captured by everything about Scientology, and he felt like it was his free will choice to be there. And that's the struggle. Like if you watch these documentaries about parents who are dealing with their kids who in college have been taken in by these other ideologies, they have to confront with the fact that their child is choosing it. And this is a documentary of this family who like almost kidnapped their kid, and while they were driving back with their kid from one of these groups, he ran out of the van and called the cops because he felt like he was being kidnapped with his own family. So it gets into your mind and it just totally distorts your free will. And so as a society, we have to balance. We want people to act on their own free agency with the fact that people can be manipulated and their agency can be interfered with. And what Chris is talking about, and what I'm hoping you'll start to have a more, nuanced or complex view of is how that free will can be distorted, and it can color the way that you'll interact with people.
I didn't have a complex view before, did I?
Well, if you're making the case, if you're describing what the church is doing as doing something against somebody's will, then it reflects that you haven't incorporated that knowledge or that insight into how you assess groups that may hold people physically like that.
It's not that I haven't incorporated that knowledge. I'm very aware of the worst accusations against the Church of Scientology. All I am saying is that in this process, I am refusing to believe anything that I cannot verify myself. Actually, I shouldn't say I'm refusing to believe anything. Like,
absolutely all for bullshit.
If there was now, okay, I'm qualifying my statement here. Give me a second.
Okay.
If there were like video or audio of evidence, okay, like what I'm saying is, I am purposefully going into this, just like I said in my podcast, with eyes wide open. And what I mean by that is that I am emphasizing and placing higher value on personal lived experience than I am on hearsay.
Hold on. You railed against the wokes for relying on lived experience. I've heard you, because that's the new epistemology, is lived experience. No.
Yes. No, you can develop bad opinions. And by the way, lived experience, you're right. That's actually a very charged word because it does insinuate some kind of political bias behind it. What I should have said is personal experience. Is that before I go out and say Scientologists are mean people, I want to go out and have some experience with those Scientologists so that out of personal experience and personal interaction, I can develop an opinion. And Chris, I really thoroughly believe that
you will not have a greater ally than me in going after an organization with all the resources and tools at my disposal if I find that any of these accusations are true in my personal life. Okay. You will also not have any greater enemy than me in defending my own personal experience if I feel that that either wasn't lived up to or is being misrepresented. And that's really what I mean by eyes wide open. And the other thing I would say is before this
allows us to talk about the concept of splitting and black or white thinking. Keep going.
Yeah, that's fair. The last thing I'll say is before we even entered this conversation, we had like a week's worth of interaction with these people. And just so you don't think I'm doe-eyed or that I was, just oblivious to my fact that I'm a media person, I was very carefully observing, and so was Brad and Kwaku, how these people interacted in their follow-up. And it was very interesting because the girl that was assigned to Brad, because he had a different experience than I separated myself from Brad. Kwaku, I didn't see him for an hour and a half. He had his own different experience. And then I had my experience with Peter. Okay.
You guys, do you realize you volunteered to split yourselves up? That's what destructive groups will try to do so that you
see
are
each
vulnerable as individuals?
We could see each other in the room. What I meant to say was there was enough privacy where the person could talk with him privately without feeling I was looming over and observing what he's the reverse of what the Sea Org supposedly did to Chris. Did it.
Hold on. Say, what are you talking about?
Okay. Chris claimed that he couldn't leave the building without two other people supervising him. Right, Chris?
There was a period of time where that happened.
Yeah. Okay. So
you're saying that you allowed yourself to be individual.
If I'm looming with Kwaku by my side over Brad while he's talking to somebody in visitor center, wouldn't you say that would taint the experience of Brad to be able to be open and honest about his experience because he would feel like there's two co-hosts of his show looming over him?
Yeah.
No, I'm going to say no, and I'll explain to you why. Okay.
As
much as we hate Foucault, it has to do with power dynamics.
Okay.
When you have two Scientologists that are out on their own, both of them know that if they step out of line or if they say or think or do something, that the other one's going to report them in. There's a control element to it. You two guys there, neither of you are like, oh, I'm afraid. Kwaku's not like, oh, I'm afraid if I say the wrong thing, Cardin's going to fire me or he's going to threaten my spiritual existence. There's no power control dynamic between you guys there. So there's no incentive for you guys to be together. Now, Cardin, before this gets too far off the rail, I want to give you some credibility here, okay? In the clips that we've watched, when you listen to Brad, his eyes are like teary, the heaven rays are showing, and he's extolling the virtues of his experience there. When you listen to Kwaku, he's talking about his skepticism of every other grand narrative, which leads him to at least consider their narrative. And to your credit, you say, listen, I watch those documentaries, there's a lot of crazy stuff. Let's see what we see there. There is definitely a different flavor to your approach in what you've said, in what we've seen so far, contrasted with Brad. And that now I do get the sense, and I agree with Chris, that there is kind of a positive feel that you guys are all weaving together in describing your experience here. But I want to make sure that we continue this so that we can get through it, and then we'll have a more in-depth discussion.
Couldn't that be expected by three intelligent men? And I think you're all intelligent. But wouldn't you say that probably most organizations put their best foot forward and that everybody's pretty much going to come back from their first 2 or 3 hours having good things to say about the nice PR people they met? And won't any kind of expose or any kind of bad things to be said about that organization probably be a result of them acting in bad faith later? For example, maybe not conducting these interviews like they said they would, maybe not letting us see certain things that go beyond what could be expected by religious freedom. Wouldn't that be kind of a natural order to things as you're investigating them?
That's a good question, Chris. Would you have a response to that? I know what I would respond.
Well, the only reason I'm a little puzzled by that is, yes, of course.
Okay.
There's no evidence in your podcast here that you demonstrated knowledge of that before you went in there. You're only saying that now that we're challenging you.
Oh, did I not say that I'd seen and named by name multiple documentaries that have been done on the Church of Scientology?
No, yeah, you did. That was in the podcast.
You said that you watched them.
Okay.
While you demonstrated no knowledge or critical skepticism about Scientology, both when you went there and in relating your experience about it. So you said,
because that was a strategic error.
if I might finish, you said it in almost lip service fashion. Yes, I watched every minute of all of these negative documentaries about it, and I chose not to believe any of it until I lay it, my own eyes on the situation. And then you go do that and come back with this, glowing report about it. And when we challenge you, you say, oh, well, yeah, in the first 3 hours, you're only going to really see the surface and you'd have to dig in deeper, which was kind of our entire point all along.
Okay. I don't really understand how one or the layman could watch my podcast and think this was a glowing review. Maybe
what?
Can I?
It's a glowing review of your experience.
Okay,
just as you said.
Can I finish? I could see why somebody might think Brad was a glowing review. However, I'd encourage you to watch more of the show. The guy doesn't have anything bad to say about anybody. Okay,
that's true. He's Canadian.
So, I mean, I don't think Brad gives anything other than glowing reviews. Now, Chris, unfamiliar with our show, and especially with, I believe you, an abusive experience in the church. Okay. I could see why that would rub you wrong, and I want to be respectful of that. Okay. With Kwaku, familiarize yourself a little bit with Kwaku. He'll chase you down any other rabbit hole that leads to Alice in the Looking Glass and then come back up with a toy to show you. Okay. That's one of the endearing aspects of him. And I learn a lot from him. So I don't besmirch him for that. You will notice me. And you can go back and watch the podcast. I said, I give credit where credit was due and then articulated the credit I was giving. And the credit was bureaucratic. I've been given the brush off saying, oh, you got to talk to our PR people. Oh, and guess what? They're not there, which means you can't talk to anybody. So goodbye. I've gotten that runaround from as a radio host 100 times. And I didn't get it from the Church of Scientology. So in my limited experience, I gave credit where credit was due. And that's it. I think giving credit where credit is due is not a glowing review. It's giving credit where credit is due and trying to be ethical in my representation of my experience.
Okay, Cardin, I want to answer your question about wouldn't any group put their best foot forward? Okay, and that is that, there's a cycling group in my local area. If I go and I show up, they're going to tell me all about the great meetups that they have, the great events that they have, the great things that they have. And it's true. Any group that you go to will give you a great best foot forward. That's what we all want to do when we're part of an institution or an organization. Sure. The best foot forward is not the thing that really anyone is concerned about. What people are concerned about are what are the negative things that people coming from an organization has. So when I go to this biking group, I may see somebody who used to be in the biking group and say, yeah, oh, Sheila, she's like a tyrant. She makes everybody show up with clip-on shoes and I don't like clip-on shoes or something like that. But the worst thing that they have to say about the group gives us a sense of the character of the group. Okay. Yes. And so if you were to compare that cycling group, and if I go and I have a pleasant experience and the worst thing is that Sheila's kind of a tyrant as the head of the group, that's different from if I go to the Scientology group and I have a great experience, but the worst thing that I'm hearing is that, oh, they imprisoned a woman, kept her from medical care, and she died. And we haven't, all the other things that are part of these different documentaries. The nature of the worst part of those experiences changes not only the way that you approach the group, but how you interpret that initial positive experience. And it's that type of assessment that I know Chris and myself would like you to look at when you approach these things. Now, you could say, I've watched these documentaries. When you admit that, then what you're saying is that you acknowledge that there is a need to account for these negative experiences, especially because there is a plurality of them and they are consistent and coherent. And so it raises the legitimacy of those negative experiences. So that's something you have to wrestle with this in there. So what that does is it means that any degree of positive experience that you will talk about here, it really doesn't matter. And you could go and talk to them about all the pleasant, positive things. That doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the reality, nature, and extent of those negative things, because it's those negative things that define the group as unhealthy. And it's true for Scientology as well as any other group, whether it's, a local political activism core or anything else like that.
To me, that seems like just basics. I agree with that.
Okay. All right. Well, I think if we're in agreement with that, let's keep going.
It's like, if the worst things that are true about Scientology are true, then it's an evil organization. If I have an experience that shows that these worst rumors aren't true, then I'll form my own opinion and say, that wasn't my experience. Like, I don't see what's controversial about that.
What is it that you imagine it would require for you to lay your eyes on the kind of abuse that's been described over and over again in the documentaries that you watched?
That's a good question.
Okay, that's a good question. It's kind of sad that it took us an hour and a half of presuppositions about me to get there. Are you familiar with sample sizes in polling?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you ever studied the science of how people do polls? Okay, maybe this is just from my political background and the fact that I had a bunch of political podcasts, but the amount of
statistics in college, I understand.
Excellent, rock on. Something that's always amazed me personally is the accuracy with which some of these polling organizations, if they actually approach a poll ethically, the accuracy that you can pull of the macro group from a 2,000 person sliver. Mm-hmm. Like just the ability of a small sliver to represent the group as a whole to sometimes 99.9% accuracy is that is mind-bogglingly accurate. All right. Now, I'm not going to self-aggrandize. I'm not Rasmussen. Okay. But there is a parallel here. I have studied and had firsthand experiences with enough political, religious, and protest organizations as a radio host and as an independent filmmaker that I have come to believe and trust my own instincts that my sample size, though it's small, can oftentimes detect pretty accurately the ethos of an organization. And with all the negative rumors flying around and the positive rumors flying around, I said, you know what? I want to do my own poll and I want to go get my own sample size. And I know it's going to be small because I'm not Leah Remini. I don't have millions of dollars. I know it's going to be small because I'm not Howard Stern and I don't have millions of dollars. But you know what? I trust my talents, my skills, my ethics, and my ability to actually go get that good small sample size. And if they are people who are interested in emotional coercion to gain religious faith, that can't hide for too long. And if they are people...
Say something like that.
I think that's the nature of evil.
Interesting. And what is it exactly that you believe you can detect in people, that you can see with your own eyes, that tells you their psychological state and the truth of that state?
That's a good question. I've been comparing notes with Brad and with Kwaku and with me in our experience since then. Mm-hmm. For example, with something as basic as the follow-up. How do they follow up with us? Okay.
Mm-hmm. You give them your addresses?
Oh, everything. I operated as though
Okay. Are you sure you watched the science? Like, the fact that you gave them the addresses and that you're publicly now discussing it online.
I've had BLM protest my house.
Yeah.
Cool.
I've been attacked.
I just think you like Scientology mail because you're going to get it for the rest of your life. That's all I'm laughing about.
Yeah,
Cardin, I want to just address something here. You mentioned having a sample size and going to get a sample size. You don't go to a place where you have a uniform monolithic bias and try to get an assessment and believe that you have some sort of reflection of reality.
I'm not basing my entire experience on these 3 hours. I have developed a rapport with some people. I plan on doing some interviews. I'm approaching it ethically, and I'm simply representing my own experience. And just because I give credit where credit is due, That's fine. People like Chris get all angry at me saying I'm some kind of defender of Scientology when I'm not. And I've actually been very scrupulous, not unscrupulous. I've been comparing notes with Brad and Kwaku's experience and then comparing them with my own. And for example, the nice girl that Brad met, reached out with her. reached out and followed up and said, hey, I'd like to know what you thought. Didn't automatically say, can you come in for a class? Wasn't pushy. He said, you know what? I'll be back in a month. I'd like to check in with you then. She did nothing more than a nice, sweet little missionary would do at our visitor center. So I'm not here to defend the Church of Scientology, but some of the worst rumors that I've heard that they'll follow you home if you show up once, I can pretty much attest to you. Nobody followed me home and nobody harassed us over the phone the first week we talked to them.
You bring up an excellent data point, Cardin. Now, Chris, is there a rumor that if you visit a center, they will follow you home?
Yeah, and it came from the anonymous protests where they did.
That's interesting because I spoke and interviewed with the anonymous guy holding the sign on L. Rob Hubbard Lane, and that's where I heard the interview because I'm not an ignorant and unscrupulous and naive person to these worst claims against the church. Yes, Chris, you will be held accountable for the first 5 comments you made about me for the duration of this next 5 minutes.
Oh, come on, Cardin. He's getting to know you better. Let him at least learn at your particular personality quirks.
There is a data point right there. I have 3 data points that I can give you. Okay. The very first thing I did when I walked in was actually, I shouldn't say this because people are going to misinterpret this as me trying to bring up a negative thing. But one of the very first things I said to the person at the gate was, I said, your undercover security sucks. Because there was a plainclothes person in front leaning in a way that obviously was hiding some kind of protective, I don't want to say firearm, but some kind of protective unit. And he stuck out as badly as those fake underground FBI guys at those rallies in Michigan did. So I jokingly made a joke at the person behind my desk. And I said, hey, yo, is that person there somebody protecting this facility? And they said, oh, yeah, he's a pretty tough guy. And he's like ex-law enforcement or something like that. I was like, yeah, well, he's also a little bit obvious. Anyway, we're here. You know what I mean?
All right, Cardin. Let's get back on rail. Let's get back on track. I appreciate your anecdote. Okay, so I want to make sure we get through y'all's.
If I could
go ahead, Chris,
for a second, if I could,
please do.
I actually asked a question that I still haven't gotten an answer to.
What was that?
What?
What is it exactly that you believe you're going to see with your own 2 eyes that's going to show you or somehow indicate to you that these negative stories about Scientology are true?
Okay, that's a very good question. And I have the humility to say, I don't know exactly what it is I'm looking for, but just how I think it was Clarence Thomas said, I can't describe pornography, but I can tell it to you when I see it, whatever that famous quote is.
Yeah, the one from the turn of the 19th century, actually, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, whatever it is. Thomas Sowell or Clarence Thomas, I don't remember who it was.
Yeah,
but
Clarence Thomas.
Okay, so Cardin, that places you in the same category as Holocaust deniers, because you could have said, hold on. You could have said, I will listen to, hold on, Cardin. You could have said, I will listen to someone who survived it and experienced it.
Instincts is not even close.
No.
Me saying I trust my observational capabilities and my own instincts to detect coercive BS when I find it is not an idiot who doesn't recognize a freaking.
So what do you say to a Holocaust denier who says, I don't believe these people who claim to have survived the concentration camps?
The Nazis and was imprisoned twice by the.
So only because you have a personal family connection, do you believe it?
Oh yeah, only because. I've ruled out every other reason, John, and I must.
Well, I'm just saying, you're sitting here in a podcast. You're sitting in here on a podcast with someone who is a survivor of physical internment and physical abuse at the hands of Scientology.
Report to that person saying,
you're saying you won't believe him until you see some other evidence.
No, I have not said I will not believe him. I encourage your audience to watch this podcast. Twice in this podcast, I have said, I believe you. I believe that was your experience. I encourage Chris to defend me and now say, did I or did I not say, I believe you and I believe that was your experience?
No, I think you did say that, but I still don't. But I would like to get back to my question because the Holocaust denial.
I'm finishing answering Jonathan's question simply by saying I am going to have an experience in which I choose to rely more on my own personal observational skill.
Okay, Cardin, you've said this again. We understand that
Why
perspective.
is it not sinking in?
Because you're inconsistent.
No. My question on that exact personal experience is, what are your parameters? When do you know, oh, there's something wrong here, there's something hinky here? What do you need to see, or what do you expect to see in your tours and interviews with Scientologists at that level? Where do you think that's going to go?
Okay, here's a perfect example.
Yeah.
I'm not committing to some specific thing right now, because also that would be a gross strategic error on air. If I were to say, oh, if I see this, then I'm going to say this about the Church of Scientology, and the Church of Scientology saw that, then what do you think they'd be avoiding? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm humble enough to say I don't have anything specific that I'm looking for, but I have such a wide berth of experience in film and radio and religious and protest and political organizations that I've come to recognize the difference between good faith actors and bad faith actors. Here's an example that's banal, okay? But I was a door-to-door salesman for years in order to pay for my college education. And let me tell you, there is a huge difference between the general sales practices of Kirby vacuum cleaner salesmen and Cutco knife salesmen than Orkin door-to-door pest control salesmen. Okay. Some are pushy. Some use shame and guilt. I literally heard a recording of a Kirby vacuum person tell a mother that she didn't care about her children's health if she didn't buy a Kirby vacuum because they were going to get sick off the particulates in the air that Kirby vacuums protect you from. And to me, that is a kind of emotional manipulation that I find unethical in sales. And I personally never engaged in, never saw engaged in my company, nor tolerated engagement with when I was a sales representative for Orkin Pest Control. So though both an Orkin salesman and a Kirby vacuum salesman are both door-to-door salesmen, I find that there are sales practices you can detect easily if you are experienced that you recognize as unethical. Now let's take this example and let's put it into the religious sphere. I've been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints my entire life. Similar to you, I had a childhood indoctrination, but not really though, because my parents were actually, I wouldn't say inactive, but not.
I can vouch for this, Chris. He's not a hardcore fundamentalist Mormon.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm not throwing my parents under the bus. They were dedicated to teaching as best they could me, spirituality, God, and the importance thereof. They just maybe weren't as good at it as some other committed members of some other faiths. Okay. So I chose my faith as an adult later on in my life, showing gratitude for the good things in my faith. I am not unaware of some of the baggage my faith carries with it. However, I find most of the criticisms of it online and by ex-members of the church who have an axe to grind or profit to be made. I don't find them made in good faith, and I don't find them ethical. So I try and go out and get my own adult experience in order to know for myself. That's all I'm doing here. I'm going into the Church of Scientology. And if I detect as a lifetime member of a faith that has seen people's lives ruined by Jehovah's Witnesses, that use the worst aspects of excommunication in order to emotionally leverage and entrap people in a faith that they did not believe in, okay? If I detect that, I will be the first referee on the field throwing a red flag. All I'm
saying, I just want to bring this conversation back to Chris.
I believe the things that he's saying, but my problem or my quandary here is,
answer your question now is what would I recognize? Yes. Okay.
What are you looking for?
Coercive. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Although the week's over there, so I think they've already passed this week, this first test. I did not recognize any kind of coercive sale tactics to get us to go back there physically.
Mm-hmm.
Neither did Brad, neither did Kwaku.
Do you think that telling them you're a media personality might have had some influence on that?
Yes, that's why I reserved that discourse until I had already developed a genuine and personal relationship as best I could in those first 3.5 minutes, as we discussed in the first part of this podcast, because I recognized that was as good as it could get.
that didn't really accomplish anything. I mean, if you think you made a personal connection with a Sea Org member in 3 minutes, we have other issues.
I'm not saying it was the best personal experience, personal connection. I'm saying it is better than had I gone in there with a business card and plopped it on the table.
Fair enough.
Carden,
and yet,
why can't you say fair enough and we move on? Because that's all I'm saying.
But
Okay.
So you do accede, or you do admit then that because you're a media personality, you may be getting different treatment right now.
Yes, and that's also why, even though you guys mocked it, I chose to take a slightly different route throughout the facility and interact with my guy and do my best to develop my rapport with my guy.
Right. But now you went in there with these other folks, right? Your other podcast partners.
Yes.
They were also connected with you. So the church also knows that they are connected with you. Therefore, you're a media personality. Maybe they are too. They're all on a podcast. Being sensitive to that and aware of that, you didn't mention once in the things that I've watched so far that you were probably getting special treatment.
I am aware that once somebody finds out you're a member of the media, gears most likely shift in their brain. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm aware that there's aspects of that I cannot combat. So I have to, according to my personal ethics and my personal desire to represent my experience to my audience as transparently and as ethically as possible, okay, I tried my best to mitigate as much of that situation as I could by developing as good a relationship as I could before I said I'm a member of a media that would like to have an interview. So at least I would be having that interview with a person that would have been assigned to me as though I were a layman.
And Chris, to his credit, he mentions that conversation and the people saying, oh, hold on, you got to talk to PR people. And then he says, then we would transition to interacting primarily with the PR people on that.
Well, he does.
PR specifically.
Carden, let's let Chris talk real quick.
He does acknowledge that, but he doesn't acknowledge the bias that put over the entire experience. And it's not even acknowledged because I don't even know if they were aware of it.
Look, I feel I've stated this many times, but in case there's any kind of confusion.
Well, no, I agree, Carden. Just tell me if you disagree with this. I feel like in this conversation, you've acknowledged that there is an inherent bias to the whole paradigm. And that level of acknowledgement wasn't necessarily a big part of your initial podcast, but I hear you saying it now. I hear you understand that there's that.
In the limited time, see, so this is what some people forget. It's a live stream. My audience is generally 19 to 35-year-olds. Okay. Mm-hmm. We're telling a story to a bunch of teenagers and 20-somethings about a fun trip to the freaking Scientology Center was. And we're trying to represent it as ethically and really as possible. Sorry, I didn't cover my bases and use Robert's rules of engagement while speaking with my co-hosts. And then
you just admitted that you're taking teenagers and young adults and introducing them to the shiny candy of Scientology.
This is why
that's not good.
This is why these internet conversations get so toxic so fast, because you can't simply tell a story. It's the Lou Perez thing. You can't
tell a story. I want to pull this back. Hold on, Carden. I know you're going somewhere. It's my show, dude. All right. So I want to pull back to something that I detected a point of agreement that in what you said a few minutes ago that I want to just reflect on. You agreed that the family disconnection aspect of the Jehovah's Witnesses was terrible. Whenever they disfellowship and dissociate someone in the Jehovah's Witness, the whole family cuts that person out. You mentioned that in your description of Jehovah's Witnesses. And
the reason why I view that as completely different than some of the cultural implications within Mormonism is that, as I've best been able to detect through my own research, that is actually a pen on paper doctrinal aspect of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And if
now I want to share with you my own story now. Okay. I was living in a house. I got a knock on the door. I had been listening to ex-Jehovah's Witnesses for a long time. They showed me the reality of that policy. And I invited the Jehovah's Witnesses to come in and talk to me because they wanted to share, a scripture lesson. And I specifically said, hey, I'm open to listening to you guys, but I've heard these rumors that when somebody leaves the Jehovah's Witnesses, they get kind of cut out. They get disfellowshipped and cut out from even their family. And the guy looked at me and said, absolutely not. Now, I knew that happened because I'd heard it so many different places. I'd watched videos of their own leaders saying these things. And so I was confronted with this guy in my house lying to me about something that I knew was true. Now, if I took the uncritical perspective that did not take any of the critics at their word, then I would have said, you know what, all those other people are probably lying, and you're telling me that you don't do it, so you guys must not do it. Tell me more. And I couldn't do that, though, because I understood, and I had already seen enough evidence of the problem that I could then say, well, actually, this guy is lying to me. Now, I'm sure that if you were to go in and say, hey, I've heard about this whole suppressive person thing, like, what is this suppressive person thing, to one of the people there.
I watched that video.
Okay, so Chris, tell me, if you're there in that center, Cardin and his crew comes in and they say, hey, what's up with this SP thing? Like, that sounds weird and culty. How would you respond to that?
Well, there'd be a number of different ways depending on who I thought Carlton was.
Okay, well, let's say he's not a media person. He's just straight up normal person.
Yeah, what we would generally do is you downplay the hell out of it, right? Tommy Davis has gone on CNN and directly said, back when he was the church spokesperson, there is no such thing as disconnection in Scientology as you're characterizing it. And that was the most blatant lie he ever told. And probably one of the reasons he's no longer doing that job. The disconnection policy, the written dogma, the rules on it are accessible. You can look them up, you can find it. But Scientology what they'll do is they will downplay, oh, that's only when you have toxic people in your life. And a suppressive person's really kind of a really nasty, toxic person. You know the type, the guy the boss who won't ever have you let you have a raise, or the spouse who's constantly belittling you and denigrating you and telling you how awful you are. And
yeah, those people are really suppressive.
Yeah, they'll give you legit examples of people who are abusive or who are predatory.
People,
right? And such people do exist. And yet, then there is people who simply the church disagrees with, or people who push back on some of the more strict rules and guidelines, and no, I don't want this, and no, I don't want to buy this, and no, I don't want to come in and talk to the ethics officer about it. And that's when you get the SP declare in Scientology, but they won't talk about that part of it.
To an investigator, they won't talk about that part.
An outside
now,
person.
Cardin, I think the gem of this concept of shunning as it exists in these different organizations is good, because that gives you a focus then for your future conversation. Because I'd love to have you back and then have you relate, or just watch on your own podcast, your relation about this question. So when you go back and talk to them,
I asked that of my guy.
Okay, and so what did he tell you?
Because, for example, I don't really care what you believe. I mean, wokeism is psycho in my mind, but I got friends that are woke. So fine, believe whatever you want. I'm an evil person because of my skin color. Well, whatever. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. You want to share common ground on that, by the way.
Yeah. Okay. So if you believe and everything that Leah Remini and South Park says about Xenu and DC-10s dropping Thetans down to earth, fine, whatever. If Mormons even believed whatever weird straw man version of Mormonism, the Book of Mormon song made out about Kolob and everything, and we want to believe that, fine, I don't care. I do care, as Mike Rinder said on a podcast with John DeLynn, how you treat people when they leave the faith and how you treat the excommunication process. And again, this is not a defense of truth that could be in your lived experience, Chris.
Yeah. Come on. What'd they tell you?
Not a defense. Well, it's like, I feel I have to say this 7 times before we do this. Okay. This is not a defense of Scientology. This is simply a representation of my one-on-one experience with a Sea Org member I felt was acting wholly decently in every way and in good faith. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
he said,
honestly, and I liked, he actually, I have to give credit again where credit is due. I asked him about that. I said, well, is this true about X, Y, or Z thing? And I mentioned Leah Remini specifically which now might taint his answer more towards Leah Remini than it would your average Scientologist. But he stopped for a second and he thought in a way that I recognized as being honest. Okay. He did not come across as a deviant person. Okay. I've dealt with people that I know are trying to give answers. I trust my own instincts in that regard, that I felt he was being honest and not trying to formulate an answer. But he stopped for a second. He said, I don't really know how to answer that other than to say that in our faith, you have to go through so many steps to actually get excommunicated that I feel you have to be dealing in bad faith with us in order to get there. Now, that's a very broad statement that could be misinterpreted, okay, and has a very wide berth for benevolence and evil. And our conversation later meandered into other topics, so I don't really feel that that's maybe demonstrative of the experience as a whole, but it was his honest answer that is another data point in my analysis that is not a defense of anything. It's an analysis of my own experience that I am taking into consideration that came across as honest to me.
Okay, Chris, rate his answer. Was it good? What do you think?
Well, I think that his answer kind of sucked. I think that's fascinating. The fact, by the way, I just have to correct you on one thing real fast. It's Remini.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry, yeah.
No worries.
I botched that.
Only because she's a friend of mine, so I have to say that. Anyway, if you bring up Leah, you're gonna get you're just gonna get the awful answer right away. See, here's the thing: you can the problem that I'm having with your logic and the way you're approaching this is, well, I have these truth detectors, C, and I'm in media, C, so I kind of know when somebody's lying to me, C. He wasn't lying to you.
You forgot the cigar. See, I'm in, see, and I got the truth detector.
Well, Cardin, just to help us understand, on a scale of 1 to 100%, how accurate would you rate your truth detector? Because you're relying a lot on it in this whole conversation. Would you say you're 100% good at detecting truth versus lies? Or how good is your detector?
That's a very good question. And Chris, that's an astute observation. And I ask that of myself. Okay. I would say I trust my own instincts more than I trust my own instincts of how I evaluate the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for example, than I do John DeLynn and Bill Reels.
Okay. So what is that percentage-wise on how good you are?
Going into the Church of Scientology, I'm aware of all of the worst rumors. I trust myself that I'm pretty decent at sorting out what's BS and what's not true. And I guess since I'm less interested in a condemnation of the church's past sins, as much as I recognize the Church of Scientology is powerful and has a lot of members. And I'm not opposed to the fact that there was widespread abuse in the church. And it seems like there's some pretty hard evidence thereof that I've seen presented in a decent way in a lot of these books and documentaries that I've seen. Okay. And I'm approaching this from the kind of the Monell doctrine. Are you familiar with what the Monell doctrine is?
No.
My parents were, I've been to the Supreme Court of the United States of America. I've been involved in a civil rights lawsuit that actually made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And one of the things that the Supreme Court established was when you're suing a governmental organization, you have to prove whether or not it is an actual, are you suing the cop or are you suing the police? If the cop did something that's against the training manual of the police, the cop is responsible. If the cop is doing something that's in the training manual of the police, now the police department is responsible. That's called the Monell doctrine. So if there is an abuser in a faith, okay, whether it's Mormonism, whether it's Catholicism, or whether it's Scientology, we need to establish it in the way we established with the Monell doctrine. Is this a common practice that is doctrine of the faith, or is this an errant person who is not operating according to his faith? And what I have found in some of these other faiths is sometimes those worst aspects are true and they are doctrinal, and then usually that leads to failure. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have had child abusers. point blank. And the church has a policy that they get reported, at least written on paper. Okay, there might have been some bishop that didn't report his buddy for a crime he committed, and he'll be held responsible in heaven and on earth for that, hopefully. But what I found is when there's been sins committed, crimes committed by members of my faith, it's been against the doctrines of the church. And our policy is that they should be responsible to both God and man. Therefore, they have been referred to law enforcement.
Okay, that's a good point. Chris, he's saying that the abuses that maybe you experienced or others experienced was actually potentially just the result of some leader going off maverick on their own. It wasn't actually the institution itself that endorsed or legitimized it. What is your take on that?
What policies from the Church of Scientology have you looked up and read regarding disconnection?
I've actually read a lot on disconnection, and to me, that's actually one of the ugliest that I have, if it is true, because to me, that would be the worst form of emotional manipulation. And it's something that I view, especially as a man who believes God is our heavenly father. I would never dream of disconnecting my own daughter. At the same time, I recognize that that's a great soundbite, and disconnection sounds like a really, really horrible thing that could be marketed by people that hate the Church of Scientology into being something worse than, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say worse, into being used by somebody who wanted to hurt a personal relationship. Like, divorces get so bloody, I wouldn't put anything beneath somebody in a bloody divorce. I've seen people in divorces.
Okay, Chris, Chris, I want to.
The reason
a Scientologist using disconnection as a way to hurt kids during a divorce, just because they want to screw their wife in that divorce and hurt her emotionally. So the question is that Scientology's fault, or is it that ugly divorcee's fault?
Yeah, and that's not the question at all. That's a complete diversion. What I asked you is, have you read the church's policies on disconnection?
Not recently enough that I could quote them here.
Okay, so you don't know the church's dogmatic view on disconnection.
I wouldn't say I don't know. I'm very aware of all of the claims that I've seen in all the documentaries and how brutal that it is.
Right, but you haven't read it.
I haven't experienced it firsthand. Well, I've read the book once, and there's a whole chapter on it.
You have dogmatic differences versus bad apples. And so now I'm asking you, good. So in determining whether something's a bad apple or dogmatic, you would need to go get familiar with the dogma, right?
Yes, and the concept of a suppressive person needing to be wholesale blocked or ignored, I view as a very powerful weapon that, if abused, could be considered, in my view, some of the worst emotional and unethical leverage you could put on somebody. Again, I believe in the third commandment. I believe that religion given to us by God has power that should not be abused.
Chris, you've drawn that line, Chris. My
point is that if you were going to go interrogate a Scientologist, as you mentioned you're going to go do, you're going to have another interview, you're going to have more experiences with these folks.
An interrogation's a little bit different than an interview, but yes.
Well, by interrogate, I mean ask questions. I don't mean the inquisition. So you're going to go have a conversation, and you're going to go talk about this, is what you're telling us. And yet, I'm pointing out that it might be a good idea, since you're making a valid point that bad apples versus dogma is a judgment factor in whether a group's bad or not. That's a valid point. But familiarize yourself with the dogma before you go talk to them. Otherwise, your questions are going to be useless.
I'm familiar with the doctrine. I'm familiar with the accusations of how it
actually read what it says, so that you're actually familiar with L. Ron Hubbard's exact words on the matter, so that you will know whether it's being used abusively or not.
Okay, I'm familiar with the doctrine of disconnection, and I don't even know if they use the term doctrine. I think, don't they say the technology or the science, or there's a different word that they use other than doctrine. We use doctrine a ton in Mormonism.
That's right.
So I'm familiar with the concept, shall we say, of disconnection. Yeah. I'm familiar with ad nauseum stories online and in print of how that technology or doctrine has been used unethically. What I'm interested in is figuring out whether or not, according to the Manel doctrine, that is indeed a misinterpreted dogma, or what L. Ron Hubbard intended. And I'm actually interested in something a little bit larger here. We can go through.
Carden, I'm going to have to stop you right here because I need to make sure this conversation goes forward. And the thing that will drill down to the question here is, you heard a response on this thing that you say you know a lot about, disconnection. You know, you've read it. You heard an answer, and it didn't immediately trigger the he's misrepresenting it and he's lying to me alarm bells, which means that what he said was consistent with your understanding of the doctrine. Now, Chris, when you heard that description, did it ring off any alarm bells that he's misrepresenting it for you, who has maybe a deeper familiarity with the doctrine?
Yeah, of course.
And in what way? And if you were going to point Carden to some place where he could see it, where would you point him?
Well, he says he's seen the documentaries on this, right, where it's been very clearly laid out that it was used as an ideological weapon in order to enforce compliance and blackmail people into staying involved with Scientology and keeping their mouths shut. That's very clearly demonstrated over and over and over again in the disconnection stories that are promoted and talked about and written about, right? And so we see ideological principles and we see dogmatic, controlling use of this implement, this weapon of disconnection. Whereas L. Ron Hubbard writes bulletins and policies that say it's supposed to be used in this very constructive way in order to keep toxic people out of your life. The problem, the actual crux of the matter, is not whether it's dogmatic or not. The crux of the problem is what defines a toxic personality in the world of Scientology.
And who exercises
hinges on a very exact thing. And that exact thing is, you disagree with the church.
Yeah.
Oh, you disagree with the church? You disagree with David Miscavige? You have a problem with what's going on here? You're out. If you don't shut up and comply, you're out of here.
Yeah, and that speaks to
right. And no member experiences that until they do.
Until you disagree.
And then you're out, and you're not there to be asked anymore.
Okay, I want to put a punctuation on this chapter so that we can keep moving on, because I don't want to have to end prematurely because I have to go somewhere.
I'm not here. And this little project we engaged in, okay, was not to be a court of establishing whether or not that did happen. I believe, especially knowing how the Christian right and the intolerant suburban right was in the 90s and the early 2000s, I believe that there was probably a wide-scale misuse of the doctrine of disconnection, whether supported by the church officially or not. I believe most people that are saying that in good faith, and it is true.
Okay, and I also want to say, you mentioned that there's ad nauseum reports of this. If the thing is real and it's being abused and they're doing it to a lot of people, anyone who criticizes of it, and those people are speaking out, there's going to be ad nauseum reports of this thing happening. And you can't use the fact that there's so many reports of it as some sort of way to dismiss it, when it in fact enforces the legitimacy and authenticity of that experience.
Okay, the only thing
now, I'll give you 10 seconds, then we got to move on.
Okay. All I'm saying is I think my curiosity for this project was more to see what the Church of Scientology is and not what it was, because I don't see how any large organization as big as they are could not have learned from this massive media scrutiny that's come about in the past 12 years. So I'm kind of curious to see what the Church of Scientology is, not what it was, if that makes sense.
So you went to see what Scientology shows the public in the most controlled environment possible, which is, you've already admitted that's not exactly what it is. That's just what it wants to display itself as. Chris, how many members of Scientology are there worldwide?
About 30,000 max.
Okay, Carden, is the Church of Scientology this huge organization? 30,000 members?
Grow up in Los Angeles, it's a little bit bigger.
Okay, well, a pocket,
no,
of course, but that's where you're taking your small sample size. All right, let's keep going.
I just
go ahead, Chris.
I have to address this just since it came up, because I was going to ask about this. It's about 30,000 members. You have not seen the membership rolls. I have held them in my hand.
Yeah. And that's a big criticism of Mike Winters on his blog.
Hold on, let Chris finish.
I've actually held them in my hand. So you have no basis on which to judge the size of Scientology other than what they tell you.
That's a good point.
Have more than that. And so I'm just letting you know it's not a large organization.
Chris, what does the Church of Scientology say its membership size is?
Millions.
Does it quantify that? Like Mormonism's around what, 15 million?
The last time they gave a number to it, they said 10 or 11 million.
Okay, well, I would not hold that against Cardin for believing that there was the number that they say there is if he starts at. Okay, no, that's a good clarification.
We didn't really broach that I can really remember too much discussing the size of the church. I'm aware of the claims of ex-Scientologists, like going and saying we're all the Scientologists, they're building buildings, but they're not getting attended. And I've seen that on a lot of the blogs.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of this criticism. That specific criticism has not been one of the topics that I've been engaging with these people on, but I am aware of it.
Cool.
Okay. All right, let's keep going here.
Enthusiastic talking to you guys and like wanted to show you like books and things that would help. But for me, I don't know, maybe they thought I was just a lost cause or something.
Well, you also walked in with a plastic safe case
Yeah.
which had
For your
technology,
camera, yeah.
but it looked like you were holding a bomb. You're 9 feet tall with a beard, and you walk in, you're like, we want to film some Scientologists.
No,
and
I
they were like,
didn't. I
"Okay."
was
Oh,
super nice. Stop it. So anyway, I had a lovely and touching conversation with Peter. He came over, you know, and these guys were doing a good job. They ingested probably 5 or 6 groups while we were there. We were just one of maybe I'd say 20 or 30 people that came by. And, you know, you hear the horror stories. You're always like wondering like, oh, what's going on, right? But they were totally down, totally nice, super cordial. And this Peter guy, he actually sat down, got comfortable with me, and we just had like a heart-to-heart, bro to bro. And I asked him all the tough questions, and he gave me some great answers.
Yes.
You can't have any conversation with Cardin without it being bro to bro. That's just his personality.
And great enough, I decided I want to do a little mini documentary on what it's like just going there for the first time, like no BS, no ex-member BS, no pro-member propaganda or advertising or whatever.
Okay, hold on, Cardin. How are you going to have a documentary without pro-member propaganda when you go to their visitor center and talk to the people whose job it is to give you pro-member propaganda?
Okay. So yes, only a Sith speaks in absolutes. And when I am speaking colloquially with my friends on a podcast,
Okay.
I say no BS here, no BS there. What that really translates into in the real world is I'm limiting the outward here and I'm limiting the outward here and I'm focusing on the personal here.
You're not going to go to like crazy extremes either way.
Yeah, I don't know why this is why I have to keep explaining. Every time I make an example like this and I do it in a fun hyperbolic fashion, all I'm saying is that I'm focusing on what I have experienced and less on what all of us have heard, because I'm interested in maybe possible other things like a redemption arc, the future. What is it now instead of what was it then? If I judge Catholicism by what the Borgias did in the 14th century, I'd never want that institution with a mile of my church. Well, I mean, of my children. But with the way things are now, I'd have less of a problem with sending a Catholic. You know, so it's like, I mean, I feel like there's nothing unethical with saying I'm going to limit the outer influences with my personal experiences. There's nothing.
Okay, now, I'll just tell you why it's a sensitive thing to hear, why we might point to it and say, what are you talking about there? And that is because there's 2 possibilities here. One is that Scientology is this harmful, destructive, manipulative cult that abuses its members and manipulates and entraps them. And then there's this other idea that it's not that, it's just an organization that's healthy. It has maybe some minor issues, but those are all things. Now, if it is this abusive, manipulative, deceptive cult, then things like propaganda and bias are going to be the way it exists, the way it breathes and moves, and the way it attracts and ensnares new members. And the fact that that is on the playing field as a possibility means that when you do an approach like this, you have to be thinking ahead of the curve and saying, wait, we have to acknowledge that that may be part of the dynamic and just incorporate into their calculus. And I don't think that you're completely oblivious to that. I think that's something that you will spend time reflecting on, but that's why we would capture a soundbite like that, you know, take it out of context and say, what are you talking about here? You can't have no propaganda, because that's exactly what they do. Does that make sense?
I've interviewed Black Lives Matter activists who were on the same Facebook threads that are now evidence in police reports for wanting to threaten the livelihoods of co-hosts and take pictures of our license plates in order to get our home addresses. I'm not unfamiliar with the idea of having a face-to-face interaction as a member of the media with somebody who has a horrible reputation. I am not naive to this.
Okay.
I'm 40 years old.
All right.
Experience in
Point
this.
Taken. Point taken, Cardin. I'm going to continue now unless you have something to add, Chris.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, let's keep on.
For just what it's like as a third party, you know what I'm saying? That's just a respectful interlocutor that wants to just go in and get the experience and see what it's really like and show the world. And I think that'll actually be a really fun and interesting project.
I sound so stupid, like a ninja.
I just want to say that, like,
bro.
That's what's so endearing about you. It's like, whoa, it's Donatello.
No wonder Meryl Streep hates looking at herself during awards ceremonies. I mean, I can self-deprecate enough to say that literally sounded like a Ninja Turtle just ran away with Keanu Reeves in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure and then woke up 3 hours late. That was embarrassing.
All right, Cardin never changed. All right, here we go.
I imagine just how people, like, they talk about the church as being really secretive, but then if you like sit down with a missionary and ask them, you pretty much whatever you want, as long as you're not being antagonistic about it, you're probably going to get some really solid answers out of them, right? I feel like that's what happened with you. I saw part of your conversation with Peter. Like, once he was
What'd you ask your guy? I can say what I asked my guy. What'd you ask your guy?
I was chatting mostly with Krista and was just asking a little bit about the history of Scientology and the practices of Scientology. Like, what kind of things does this offer? Like, why do they have like the symbol of the cross there? What does that mean?
Yeah.
What does it mean for you guys to be living these teachings? And they were like, it's the application of your spirituality in the world, in this materialistic world.
That's something I've thought for a really long time, because Christians are always arguing about, you know, what is the right theology, but no one really asks, how do you apply the right theology?
Yeah, what's the right practicology or practical application?
It really doesn't, I hate to be the guy to say it, but it doesn't really matter at all what you believe if what you believe in practice doesn't actually improve society in your lives. That doesn't matter. And so when academics are like, well, if you read the third book of Romans, and blah, 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 and that actually goes along with St. Johnson's pigraphle of up your ass or whatever. It's like none of those things actually matter until you apply it, and you find that certain religions, when applied, actually create a better society, such as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Those teachings match well. When you believe families are eternal, you're probably going to have more kids and a better home life and a better family life that creates a better society. The nuclear family does that. So I like that Scientology is very much about application, because that matters more.
So yeah, this is what impressed me. First,
any comment on that segment?
I mean, I think I don't remember the podcast too well, but it seems like we're trying to get all of the good things that we experienced out of the way.
Well, yeah, Chris, it reminds me of an earlier segment where Brad brings up that his father was helped out of a narcotics addiction by Scientology. And it brings up this question of, does the positive and the good that a particular organization do justify the organization as a whole or someone's participation in the organization? How do we deal with the contrast between the helpful aspect of an organization like this and the harmful one? What's your take on that, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with the philosophical principle that a group is only as valuable as it is offering, you know, benefit or help to the society in which it exists. And that applies to Scientology, Mormonism, the Boy Scouts, any other group, right? The local grocery store. Any group only can justify its existence based on that. And so that makes complete sense. Where I of course, am going to take an exception with this whole thing is we went in, had a very nice, cordial conversation with some people, and therefore it's all good. That's where I kind of have that problem. And I know that you know, that's not what Corden is saying, but That is absolutely positively what exudes from this entire podcast. And that's my problem with it, is because it's a very uncritical assessment. In other words, my question is, okay, so please explain to me. So my question,
Pardon, let him finish.
Actually, for you now, would be, what good is Scientology doing in the big wide world that you have seen with your own eyes and can point to and show to me as a benefit that justifies Scientology's existence? I'm curious about that.
I think that was a comment that I think that was more Brad's mental approach to this.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I hadn't really gone into it thinking I want to assess what good they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I just went, I shouldn't say I guess, but I went in there just wanting to have my own experience so I could weigh that against what I've heard.
Got it. Okay. So this statement being made in the podcast is sort of thrown out there, and then he connects dots that, well, Scientology, of course, I really appreciate that about them, and the LDS Church is good, and we know they're beneficial. So therefore, you know, sort of by implication, so is Scientology.
What I think Brad's doing is he's a very nice guy that does not speak evil of anybody.
Mm-hmm.
And he's choosing to relay a positive experience that his family had, where supposedly similar to Will Smith getting over his stage fright from a Scientologist communications class, he's saying, my brother, because again, if we're going to be ethical in our criticisms of something, we have to be ethical in giving credit where credit is due. And I think all Brad's doing.
That's where I'm going to call you out, though, because you're going to give credit where credit is due without even bothering to look where the credit actually lies.
Well, I defer you to Brad on that because that's his experience. But I know him well enough. You're doing
like,
okay, hold on just a second. Let's let Cardin finish. He was talking first, and then I'll let you.
Sorry.
It's like I'm not here to defend the Church of Scientology.
Yep.
I'm not here to defend Brad's lived experience. I mean, he made casual mention that he's willing to be open-minded about Scientology because apparently a brother who I have no personal interaction with was saved from an addiction I was unaware of. I mean, you found out the same time I did. To me, that's just a simple statement that he's a positive person that's trying to stay positive about approaching this controversial topic because his limited experience did have positive data points in that. I don't see how that's a bad.
And I interpret this experience a little bit differently than that, because what I see here is bias. That's what I see.
Well, Chris, explain what you mean. Like, how would Brad have a bias regarding Scientology?
Well, he flat out said it saved my brother, right?
Okay. So you're saying that positive experience with his brother predisposes him to really see and focus on the good stuff there, and maybe either dismiss or be blind to or not consider seriously any of the negative.
Exactly.
This is why we can't have nice things on the internet and talk about controversial subjects, because controversial subjects generally are gray areas, and gray is a formation of both black and white. And if you're going to produce that gray and talk about that gray, you have to address the white and the black. But it seems like when you're with people on the black side, you can only talk about the black, or else you're a defender of the organization. And when you're over here with the white people, you can only talk about the white subjects, or else you're an antagonist of the white organizations. What is wrong with a guy going down to the Church of Scientology, saying what his experience was like, and then mentioning casually that one of the few data points he's taken into consideration was the fact that his brother credits the Church of Scientology with overcoming a heroin addiction? I don't think you need to be...
Cardin, I just want to clarify. I didn't say that it was wrong for him to say that. I said, what do we make of the fact that there is this positive experience that someone would have had in Scientology, and yet we hear about these negative experiences? How do we integrate those two things?
Ingest it as an adult. Let's just say everything Chris Shelton says is true. Everything all the ex-Scientologists say is true. And that the Church of Scientology is right there next to that abusive dad that you knew down the street who did everything horrible to his children and his wife. Okay? Just because in court that abusive dad's kid says, well, he did play catch with me once and did teach me how to play catch, doesn't mean that all of a sudden that kid's a bad person and is enabling his... No, he is just simply saying one of the data points he took into consideration with his relationship with his dad.
This is based.
I think you may be thinking we're making something of that data point that we're not.
That's the thing, right? At no point now or at any point along the line since we started have I entered in a good, bad valuation of you or your podcast partners.
You're saying we're making a glowing review. I think all we're doing is saying how it went.
I have accused you of being uncritical, unskeptical, and giving praise where praise is not due, where more criticism or more skepticism was.
When did I ever praise an abusive behavior?
Occur.
When did I ever praise an abusive behavior? I did say I will give credit where credit is due, and I will speak on my own personal experience. When did I ever praise something I detected personally as an abusive behavior? In this podcast, I challenge.
Yeah,
it may be a difference of perspective, Arden.
You don't have any metric on which to skeptically judge this group.
You're right. Entering into this podcast, I did not make an in-depth analysis of how I would personally detect being lied to. I'm trusting upon 40 years of experience in media to detect usually what I see is pretty effective, whether or not somebody's being dishonest with me. And by the way, we don't even know how far this project is going. We might just have a couple of interviews. It might be a fun thing we did on a podcast. That's it. I'm not a paid person for NBC or a producer on.
So Cardin, I want to narrow and direct this conversation to something that's going to help us get to an endpoint. Maybe you can demonstrate real quickly on that point your balance by who you would have considered adding as a critic to your investigation of Scientology had this project continued to go on. Would you have reached out to any critics, or was your beginning premise of all the critics might be misrepresenting Scientology, therefore we're only going to look at the positive lived experience? Was that going to prevent you from ever perhaps approaching someone like Chris?
No, and see, this is where I really push back. Like, I believe investigations are like tennis. There's a hit that goes over the net, and then somebody else hits it back, and then they slowly get closer and closer and closer until somebody smashes it down, and that point is reached, okay? Just like on election night, you can't judge who wins the election when 5% of the votes are in. I am not prepared to say that I have reached a wholesale decision on what my idea formation has resulted in, because we've only done the opening volley. We went down 2 or 3 hours to the visitor center, and now I'm getting called unscrupulous, getting called naive.
Cardin, I want to agree with Chris's. I want to agree with Chris's take that this comes off. The feeling I got watching this is these guys really have, for lack of a better word,
bias. How are you guys so foolish? Always talking about my pro-Mormon bias that I supposedly have, even though I regularly call Uchtdorf the fallen one and joke about how there's a good thing there's 12 apostles, so you can disagree with half of him. My views wonder whether or not
my perspective on you is that not that you are a fundamentalist biased Mormon.
Hold on. I have said multiple times in this podcast, I have the humility to admit that approaching it as a member of the media might taint the conversation. I
respect your points here, but I really do want to move on with this conversation. Okay, I'm going to give you 10 seconds.
When have you guys shown the humility to recognize that your bias might be affecting this evaluation of me and my project?
Okay, what bias? This is good.
Clear, right from the get-go. I am completely biased. I own my bias. It's in my
now.
It's
Chris,
in my
does
paper. It is. I have an anti-Scientology bias, and I will never not have that.
Okay, Chris, does that mean that you examine any claim that might do damage to Scientology and accept it uncritically because you have that bias? Does it cause you never to criticize? What does that bias cause you to do when you assess?
I have to be 10 times more careful about how I analyze information about Scientology.
That's the point that misses when we hear people who say everybody has a bias. then that the postmodern impulse is to say, well, if everybody has a bias, then we should all simply dive into our own bias, admit it, and go forward.
Right.
When the empiric scientific principle is we acknowledge everybody has a bias, we try to understand the nature of those bias and overcome it by going above and beyond to try to check any other interpretation and try to overcome that bias.
That's
and
right.
I just want to make sure that that's part of the discussion about bias here. Now,
Yeah.
Cardin, I'm trying to move this forward because I need to get through this video because I have to leave. My daughter has an appointment. So I don't want you to think that I'm trying to cut you off. It's just like one of us tends to talk a little bit more than the other. And for you to be talking more than me, that's hard to do because I'm a talker.
It's charged.
First off, they ingested us well. First, they were very cordial, super clean, super nice place. We go in there. We introduce ourselves. I introduce Kwaku L as their biggest super fan, and he basically says, "I'm a closeted Scientologist," you know. And
How do
we
you say
say
closeted Scientologist, not closeted and a Scientologist? 'Cause
Uh,
they're very
yeah,
different
yeah, that's
things.
funny. So a closeted Scientologist. And what's really funny is we introduce ourselves as being radio hosts and running a show, and it was really interesting. I think they did a good job of assuaging what they've perceived as popular fears of just going into the Church of Scientology experience at the beginning. And they said, "Hey, look, guys, feel free to study and to learn. There's no conversion that goes here." You know what I'm saying? You
Yeah,
can be
like
a
you don't have to
Scientologist.
leave your former faith to join theirs, which was really interesting to note because I'd
I'd
never
never
known
heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I never heard that.
Yeah,
And-
they don't have a specific belief about God. Whatever you believe about God, you just keep and you just apply their principles to whatever it is. So it's not a normal religion. It's almost a fraternal order in a sense.
Well,
Yeah.
it seemed like what people claim Freemasons were before, where like you could be from any other faith, but then you did it. Before I finish saying what I liked, let's hit this. Jonah Barnes gave us another super chat here. Thank you, Jonah. Says Kwaku Uber Mensch, I love you, brother. Let's just keep super chatting until these guys all fall asleep with the camera still rolling. As long as you super chat, we won't leave.
So he called me a Gadian
So-
robber and a German. That's really
Yeah.
But the German Superman, man.
It's true.
Yeah, this-
Ubermensch.
Ubermensch.
The
Oh,
quick
wait till you hear
Ubermensch.
our Maria Orsic podcast.
Oh,
You're gonna
yeah.
like that one. You're gonna like
Yeah.
that one.
Two other
So-
super chats, by the way.
Oh crap! What are they? Hit me.
More Kwaku talking about John D. Wynn.
Oh, John D.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah.
I'm gonna fast forward.
John
You don't get to.
Bishop Ellis. He'd probably want to just like
I saw Chris,
literally renounce his own citizenship in the church at that point. You know what I'm saying? Just run-
What's that?
I said I saw Chris laughing, and I think I know what his question was. I'm
What?
aware that people can say one thing and
Yeah.
then not say another. I'm not do another.
Yeah.
So I actually asked where that was written. Not where that was written, but I asked, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And again, just to their credit, because I'm not unscrupulous and I do like evidence-based analyses. He actually came with the flyer that says, "We do not try and convert you." I think the title was something along the line of something "Happiness" by L. Ron Hubbard, that specifically had a line that said, "It is not a requirement of Scientology to leave your old faith." So I feel like I did my due diligence there to try and get, according to the Monell doctrine, the idea that I want to know whether or not that's dogmatic and inherent to the faith and doctrine, or whether or not that's practice of the person personally. Does that make sense?
Totally. This is in regards to the religious thing, right? That you can be another faith.
Scientologist without having to
You can
start
hold
your other religion.
Your
Yeah,
faith.
well, it was very interesting, and I don't know why people formulate the first things that they talk out of, but right out of the gate, probably the third or fourth thing that Peter, our guy, did say was he put his hands up. He said, "Just so you guys know, we don't require any kind. There's no conversion process here. We don't require that you leave your faith. You can enjoy this visitor center without having to." So it seems they were really sensitive to that accusation. Now, that could be a total facade, and maybe we were just bamboozled, but he came up to me with a pamphlet that mirrored what he had said in person, and so I found that interesting. That's another data point that I'm taking into consideration, that I think credit should be given where credit is due. He did that due diligence and respectfully acted in good faith, showing me where that was written.
What do you think, Chris? Is that a common talking point, or is that something that they lead with as part of their introduction to new converts?
Yeah, it comes up frequently, and it is initially true and eventually false. And that's one of the things about the true false dynamic of this conversation and other conversations about Scientology that can be misleading, is that the truth changes over time in Scientology. And so whereas you might enter in as somebody who is a deep, faith-abiding Christian or Mormon or whatever, over time, those beliefs are going to be worked over and worked on the basis of, here is a direct quote from L. Ron Hubbard on the topic. Hubbard teaches that, quote, the historic Jesus was not nearly the sainted figure he has been made out to be. In addition to being a lover of young boys and men, he was given to uncontrollable bursts of temper and hatred. That's a direct quote from L. Ron Hubbard about Jesus Christ as a man.
So it's hard to imagine someone who is a conventional evangelical Christian saying, oh, I'm going to join Scientology and keep my other faith, and being able to reconcile the two, because they seem to be irreconcilable.
Correct.
Okay.
And so
I
eventually,
can see why that would be a massive turnoff to your average Christian. Although I also, and once again, like, I'm formulating a view here.
Yep.
Okay. I kind of lament the fact that this Lou Perez thing happens and you're perceived as an apologist just because you do an investigation, because I would really like to learn from somebody like Chris through his experiences and then juxtapose that quote, which I find very interesting and is another data point that I take into my analysis. I juxtapose that with the very interesting observation that Kwaku made, that the cross behind the Scientologist sign and triangles that they had in that picture I showed you was like a cross of some organization that was like Christian in its roots in the Middle Ages or something like that. I can't remember. So it's interesting that they've adopted the iconography of a crucifix, at least partially, the logo and the icon that they put forward. While if what you say is true, that L. Ron Hubbard did say this disparaging thing about Jesus Christ, they're saying that in the back door. So like that is.
So what about that? What about that, Chris? Is that intentionally done in order to mislead and maybe make Scientology seem more accessible to the wider Christian faith? Is that why they chose that symbol?
Yes. It actually goes deeper than that. We're not going to get into a big long thing about this, but I invite y'all to check out the occult origins of Scientology, because you will find that cross, the 8-pointed cross of Scientology, comes from what's called the Rosy Cross or Rosicrucian cross. And this was something Aleister Crowley was using in his system of magic, which is what actually inspired Scientology. So go ahead and Google away from that, and you're
You're going to love this, Cardin, because the Rosicrucian Society, many people think that John Dee was one of the founders of it. You just go and throw that to Kwaku and he will love it, because he's all about John Dee. Dude,
I got to tell you that the old school occult stuff is really cool or really weird. There's no middle. It's not like farming practices in the 19th century where you just completely know what you're getting. It's not like the Bronze Age. It's literally and this, by the way, this is again where, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has been accused of Joseph Smith being just a magical gold digger, and people, I think, unfairly dismiss just because they find some accusation written on some document somewhere by some disgruntled, angry person that, Joseph Smith was just a gold-digging magician, Aleister Crowley-inspired, witch-loving, Salem washed-up leftover.
Aleister Crowley is significantly after Joseph Smith.
I know, he was in the 20s or the 30s, and he's the guy that's like this.
Okay, well, I just want to be clear. I'm not dedicating this podcast to criticizing Mormonism, okay? We're looking at your experience in this.
I'm just saying that when people say, this is just a derivative of the occult, because I've seen false accusations against early founding fathers of my faith being credited as just simply a derivative of the occult, I take that criticism with pause. It doesn't mean that I don't take it. It just means that it's another data point that I contextualize from the source as I ingest it.
If I might just throw another data point at you, and you can write this down and check it out afterwards, please do. Okay, please do. Look up the Wikipedia page called L. Ron Hubbard Affirmations.
Because Wikipedia never lies.
No, please.
Well, you can look at the sources.
To not be a jerk about this. You can also look at it in the appendix of my published book. You can also look it up in the court record, which is where the affirmations were released into the public record.
So by the way, I will look this up. I operate in good faith. I've been taking both mental and physical. And just as I say, I'm taking their data sets in. I'm taking yours in. I
Just
appreciate that.
All right, and Cardin has a good record of that, so we will take him at his word. Okay, let's keep going.
Just say, hey, look, you don't have to actually convert to learn from Scientology. And I was like, what, really? And what's so interesting is Peter came back after we'd watched a couple of the videos, Brad.
Yeah.
And he showed me L. Ron Hubbard's Path to Happiness, like a little beginner's pamphlet. You know what I'm saying? In which it literally said in the paper, to enjoy the, the benefits and blessings of Scientology, you do not, there's no requirement to renounce previous faith, this and that. And he showed me in, like, I guess the equivalent of their articles of faith, where it says that you don't have to do any kind of, quote, specific conversion process, which I thought was like, wow, dude, this guy's doing his due diligence. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
He's not just blowing smoke, and he's working hard, right? So anyway, when we sat down, we all did the Dianetics, the cans. What are those called? The e-meter.
The e-meter.
We all did the e-meter together. And I realized I was screwing with the e-meter because when I gripped it harder, it made more contact with my hands. So it'd mess it and go. And like, poor Krista was trying to get a reading on that thing, and it was just going with me, you know what I'm saying? But I heard you.
How do you know it's not because of your thetans? Like, you could really, like, it could have picked him up, Cardin. You're misattributing it.
You talked to her for like 10 minutes. And
yeah, Brad went and talked to the cute girl for 10 minutes. Yeah.
Well, what am I supposed to say now? She wasn't cute? Like, that's cruel.
Yeah. I'm just saying that flirt to convert is not just a Mormon thing. That's all I'm saying. All right.
Well, that's for sure.
But
Okay,
now,
sure.
and it's, I would see, and this is where, like, maybe we can do this in another podcast, but I would be interested in kind of studying up on that e-meter, because I did notice immediately as I wiggled it that unfortunately I was manipulating how it would react, and there was something she could react to.
Yep.
And obviously critics would inherently say that's no different than the people in the 1920s that would measure 5 grams of gold and slip their finger up on the scale, and it really was only 8 or 4 grams of gold, and they bamboozled and estafado. How do you say it in English? They fooled people, right?
Yeah. Yep.
At the same token, though, I think something modern man has a huge problem with is being honest with himself and others, and knowing that the technology of the e-meter is supposedly, as I've read in some of the books, both by Scientologists and ex-Scientologists, 1/3 of the technology of a lie detector. I would be curious to just know more about the origins of the e-meter and what it actually does. And that's probably one of the things that I would be interested in looking at in this whole process of me going forward, wise-eyed open, documenting my experience and my experience alone, not defending or accusing the faith.
So, Chris, what anything you want to add about the e-meter?
Yeah, the e-meter is the skin resistance part of a lie detector. You're right, a polygraph. It is one of the 3 things that they use. It is a highly unreliable instrument, and what you need to know about it in Scientology is that they don't talk about it as a skin resistance meter. They talk about it as a meter that is specifically calibrated to read you spiritually. And it is actually registering what they claim to be mental mass, energy that's connected with the mental image pictures that you carry around with you as a spiritual entity. That's what they say it's registering.
Okay, did they explain that to you at the
behind
time, Cardin? Did they explain it like that?
She gave us a basic rundown, and I think I did ask and say, isn't this, I didn't ask too many questions because I didn't want to divulge any kind of bias too much, but I did say something about, is this not similar to some of the technology in the polygraph? And she made some kind of affirmative, like, similarities. She was definitely interested in I'd kind of interrupted her. That's hard to believe, but I'd kind of interrupted her and her little presentation, and so I didn't get to press her, shall we say? But yeah, I'd be interested in knowing more.
Okay,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, Chris. Continue.
No, just the last thing I want to add on that, because I do want to keep this quick, is look up, if you're going to look into this or research this, I see that you seem to have some idea that a lie detector is actually a valid machine, and it's not. And I would ask you to actually investigate that a little bit more closely, because
when did I ever endorse the lie detector? I actually believe you could be trained against a lie detector, and that you.
If I got it wrong, I got it wrong. I'm just saying I would ask you to look into that a little bit more
Yeah,
closely.
you do that a lot in this podcast, Chris. Okay,
All right.
I shouldn't have
So
said.
I want to on the subject of the e-meter, Cardin. On the subject of the e-meter, I want to introduce the concept of mystical manipulation, which is this phenomenon where groups that want to imbue natural phenomenon with meaning in order to point to some special authority, insight, or divine appointment that they have, will take some natural phenomenon, whether it's in a weather event. Say again.
Yeah, like the blue lights in the Louisiana old Creole religions. I thought the blue lights from methane gas emissions were ghosts.
Yeah, so something like that, but it's more than just saying this is ghost or something. It's attributing it to something, but then using it as a lever to shift authority and responsibility and cognition to something external to the individual. So it could be someone saying, "Hey, we were going to have a special ceremony here, and there was a hurricane, but then the hurricane got diverted just so I could get here. That means God's on our side." So now the people who believe that will have a greater degree of confidence in the divine appointment of the person who says it. Or if you're holding these cans and they say, well, it's kind of like cold reading, where they say, well, something's really wrong in your life. Something is messed up. Maybe you need to talk about it because these cans are showing me that. Well, they're imbuing meaning into a natural phenomenon that's pointing to them being able to tell you more about it and getting you to trust and rely on them more. And it's a way to subtly and gradually exploit human psychological vulnerabilities that we all have about the unknown.
I'm very aware of how that technology could be abused. Like that's very easy to spot a mile away. Yeah. What I'm curious about is I would look into and be interested what they have to say is, have there been any kind of like third-party studies done on this? The polygraph people obviously instituted that 33.333% of their machine with skin resistance for a reason. Is there some kind of mutual common ground that the scientists that developed the the Scientology?
So let's put a pin on that question, because it's an interesting question, but it's peripheral to this discussion. Although I understand your point that it may, it's important for Chris's own assessment of what is real and what is not. So let's keep going on this, because I'm going to have to leave real soon.
Good, because I'm already an hour over too.
That was cool. You can share what that experience was like. I didn't see Quaco on it, but I sat down with Peter for a while, and I asked him some questions. I was like, dude, so like, what do you love about this? Dude, he's been in it from a really young age. He'd started when he was 13, and he just took a communications course. And he was like, dude, I just love it. And I was hooked, and like, I love Scientology. And I was like, well, what do you love about it? He was like helping people. Like, I see all of the good that it does. And I was like, okay, cool. And he had a wedding ring on. So I was like, oh, so you're married, and he was talking about, yeah. And that was kind of dispelling some myths that I had before. And then I asked something interesting. I said, look, dude, I'm Mormon, and I lived in Germany briefly, and I have a lot of friends that are German. Sometimes they confide in me that, it kind of sucks when you introduce yourself as German, because there's always an NAZI joke coming right now. And of course, when you introduce yourself to somebody new as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, aka Mormon, there's always some polygamy joke coming around the bend. You know what I'm saying? And I said, well, is there anything, like, as a young man who's like a dedicated Scientologist, that, you're just kind of like, you just wish people just knew the truth behind, you know what I'm saying? Or that, like, they didn't do in that regard. And he actually, I have a lot of respect, because you know what? He stopped, and he kind of got a little more comfortable in his seat, and he thought for a second, and he gave it a solid, like, I'd say 10, 15 seconds to think. And then he said, that's a good question. And he's like, if I had to pin it down, he'd say, I wish people could understand the difference between the fact that L. Ron Hubbard wrote science fiction, and that he was a science fiction writer, and his research and the technology that he developed. That though he was the same person that was writing fiction and then was writing, scripture and technology, that, like, they're not the same thing.
It's not like they're sitting there with their scripture book being Lord of the Rings. They
Yeah.
are like, this book, Dianetics, is like totally an instruction manual on how to live your life in a spiritually fulfilling way.
Uh-huh.
You know?
Do you want to pause there for a second? Because this is, you guys
Well,
got.
hold on, Carden. I want to give Chris first word on this.
Oh, yeah. Sure.
Wow. I mean, Scientology works way better than I give it credit for sometimes.
What do you mean?
You guys just uncritically believed everything they told you. It's unreal watching.
Okay, I understand that response, but explain. I know you've got a lot of thoughts going on. Explain.
Yeah, let me be super clear. Okay, L. Ron Hubbard's scientific process was exactly the same as his science fiction writing process. He literally pulled everything he wrote right out of his ass. There is not one case study. There is not one peer-reviewed study. There is not one Scientology-sponsored third-party study of Scientology.
Has there not been a university that just took it on its own, though? Like, you can't tell me there's not been an ex-Scientologist who became a criminologist for the University of Kentucky somewhere, and they just did their own study that ended up being a scientific study that either proved or debunked some of these major technologies.
In 1951, an independent university study was done of Dianetics, and it found that Dianetics was nothing. There was absolutely nothing to the claims that were being made in 1950 and 51 about it.
Yeah, what year was this? You got digital there again for a second.
That was 1951.
1951. Okay.
Yeah, one university did a study. It was a flawed study, but it was published, and I think it didn't actually get published until 58. You can look it up online. It's around. Scientology does not want, the Church of Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard never wanted, after 1952, anybody messing with their business or looking into their records, and no case studies, no information was ever made available to any third-party group about Scientology's results. L. Ron
Okay,
Hubbard,
Chris, I want to put it
all in.
So Carden, all the medication, all the medicine that you and your daughter have relied on is built up from a body of peer-reviewed medical literature with evidence-based principles that drive why when someone thinks of something, they can't just say, this is going to work. They have to test it. And that process leads to the effective therapies. So what Chris is saying is that somebody who just pulls a bunch of crap out of his butt and says this works without subjecting it to that is no different from science fiction pulling stuff out of their butt and saying, here it is. So they're both a measure of fiction in that they haven't been validated by empiric methods that apply these principles of evidence-based medicine. Now, I can't let you go because I have to go now.
Okay.
So I was going to say thank you both for being open to this conversation. I know it got heated, it got tense. You know, there's a lot of emotions. I consider both of you guys to be funny, cordial, great people, and I hope that I haven't strained my friendship with either of you. And maybe there might be a future friendship between y'all two because there's just some really fun personalities involved here. And Carden, I can't thank you enough for being willing to sit in the hot seat because I know it feels like the hot seat. And so maybe we'll continue this another time. There's another project I give you a preview on, Chris, that hopefully you'll come back and work with me on, but I do have to end it now. So
good.
Thank you both. And until next time, this has been Talk on Things and Stuff.